The Rebellion. Katamari 999. Summary. Growing Up Haddock Story 9. After years of plotting his revenge, Brandine Anderson is back. Welcome to the Rebellion. Join Hiccup, Astrid, Fearless Finn, Adriana, Eric and their friends on the epic conclusion to the Growing Up Haddock series. Will they prevail against evil, or will their entire world be destroyed? Only httyd and r/do are canon. T for limes and mature situations. Chapter 1, Cloak and Dagger. Chapter text. This is Burke. There once was a time when our fight was with dragons. When our homes were plundered by ravaging beasts with fangs and talons and fury. After generations of war and enmity, there came a day when someone new joined the fight. Someone who decided to join the fight by not fighting. By setting down his weapons. By showing kindness and stretching out a hand to his enemy. Many years have passed since then. Today, our fight is no longer with dragons, but with people who would rise up against us. People who were once friends turned to enemies. People who see everything we have built and would do anything to see it crumble. My story was an era of change. Of understanding the difference between war and peace. I strived to share what I'd learned with my people and my neighbors and eventually the next generation of Burkians. And most importantly, my children. As I feared, there would come a day when the sun would set on my time. When I'd wonder if I'd made all the right decisions. If I'd done everything in my power to prepare my children for the day that destiny would come knocking on their door. If my demons would finally come to claim me at last. Would my tombstone read, "Here lies Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III. Chief, loving husband and father, leader, dragon master, and friend." Or perhaps, failure, 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 failure. This is my story. This is Burke. And this is how it ends. The wind whispered through the shrouds as the ship cut through the waves. The darkness of the night sky was interrupted only by the twinkle of stars. The ocean lacked any sort of sparkle. It was black, cold, and unforgiving. Much like the slavers who held the ship in their possession. Besides the occasional creak of rope and sound of flapping canvas, the night was quiet. The few men above decks strolled to and fro, their lanterns held aloft as they kept watch. One such man, named Elf, hung his lantern on a hook and stretched his limbs. Glancing toward the ladder that led below decks, he withheld the temptation to slip down and head to his hammock. There was nothing out here on the open seas except frigid waters and darkness. The captain insisted on 4 men standing guard throughout the night while the helmsman kept them on course. Alf didn't see the point. They would be arriving at the island of Mayro tomorrow. They should all be getting their rest while they could. Stifling a grumble, Alf snatched his lantern up again. Tensions had been high ever since that blasted meeting of the chieftains and it had only increased in the few years since. That dragon-loving fiend from the north loved making their lives difficult. The allied clans had locked down their borders and set up tight perimeters, sent out regular scouts to keep a close eye on just how close any ships got to their homeland. As if anyone in their right mind would want to get anywhere near those barbaric islands. The sight of any dragon was enough to set Elf's hair standing on end, but a barbarian riding one. No matter. Elf was a good sailor. He did as he was instructed without grumbling. Well, mostly. Late nights and the expectation to work a full day on the morrow was never a blessed prospect. But he knew what would happen should he abandon his post. He didn't wish to be fed to the sea beasts below. As if encouraged by the thought, a flash silver flickered beneath the waves at the corner of his eye. Alf twisted on his heel and raised his lantern over the dark waters. They were infested with the beasts, like a disease. Some slippery and lithe, others flat with razor-sharp teeth. Others were larger than the ship itself and spewed water hotter than any forge. He squinted, though all he saw was black water. Not a single scale to be seen. Grunting, Alf lowered his lantern and turned away. He hated these barbaric waters. The sooner they'd finish their business on Mayro and return to the mainland, the better. A gust of wind buffeted across the deck. The lit wick of his candle guttered inside the lantern and he bent to shield it. He'd rather not search below decks for a match in the dark. Then a sail creaked sharply overhead. Alf looked upward. All was dark between the sails and the mast. Blast the wind for making him jumpy, what with all his thoughts of sea dragons and barbarians. Running a hand through his thinning hair, Alf pushed all jittery thoughts from his mind and returned to his stroll. Far be it from him to be found standing aimlessly when he should be keeping watch for any nearby ships. If he'd looked over his shoulder again, he might have seen the flash of scales that dove beneath the surface of the waves just beyond the railing. More importantly, he might have seen the dark shadow of a man crouched in the shadows of the aftercastle. He might have sounded the alarm. He might have had a moment to run. But Elf didn't notice, and therefore had no time to even scream as the man nimbly dropped to the deck behind him, clapped a hand over his mouth and lifted a silver dagger to his throat. Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III loved many things. He loved his wife, his children, his dragon, his village. He loved coffee. He loved late mornings and late night flights. He loved fixing things. Yes, he loved many things. But none of them compared to his grandson. He was reminded of this on a balmy summer day as he strolled through the village. In the rising humidity of summer, he'd taken off his usual leather gear and replaced it with a jerkin with cotton lining. The winds of the sea provided a brief respite from the heat, but it wasn't much. Toothless seemed to be enjoying the heat. His bright green eyes sparkled in the sunlight and his scales glinted in a way that showed off his powerful body. His tongue flicked past his lips every few moments as if he could taste something in the air. Probably a barrel of fish baking somewhere. The village was bustling as always. Many of the women had tied their hair up and away from their faces with handkerchiefs. Most of the men were red-faced with exhaustion as they worked. Inga Jorgensen could be seen outside the healers with a bucket of water and cups. Apparently Mara was not keen on anyone dying of heat stroke today. Just as he considered getting a cup himself, a scream shattered the happy bustle of the village. Hiccup froze as Toothless whipped toward the sound with a growl. They instantly relaxed as a 3-year-old boy tore around a nearby corner, his arms and legs pumping furiously. His golden hair bounced with each step and his blue eyes were alight with not fear, but the thrill of being chased. Seconds later, Eric Larson sprinted around the corner, grinning as he snatched his son up from the ground and spun him around. "Ha! I gotcha! Daddy, pum down, pum doo-oon!" Darin cackled as they spun. Hiccup and Toothless chortled as Eric finally ceased spinning and set his son back onto the ground. He kept a firm hand on Darin's sleeve as he tottered, clearly dizzy. Tripping, he latched onto Eric's prosthetic leg and stared up at him with a happy grin. "Again?" "I don't know," Eric said, looking up as Hiccup and Toothless approached. "Mama won't be happy if you lose your lunch." "Hi there. Looks like you two are having fun," Hiccup said, smiling as Darin gasped. "Poppy." Darin leaped forward and hugged Hiccup's knees. Hiccup picked up his grandson and planted a kiss on his cheek. "How are you, buddy? Are you good?" "Aha. Me and Daddy playing hide and seek." "Well, that's fun. Have you ever played hide and seek with Toothless?" Hiccup asked, eyeing his dragon. "He's not very good at it. I promise you'll win every time." Toothless growled indignantly. Eric snorted. "Don't encourage it. Darin's better at hiding than I gave him credit for." "Oh yeah?" Hiccup asked, adjusting his grip on the heavy boy. "Are you good at hiding?" Darin gave him a slow smirk that was distinctly Haddock in nature. "Maybe." Hiccup laughed as Eric slapped a hand to his forehead. "Gods help you both." "Gods help us with what now?" Hiccup beamed as his beloved daughter, Adriana, appeared around the corner wearing a light summer dress. Her hair was pulled up in a high messy bun as if she didn't care for looks. It was rather hot. Even Eric's wavy hair was curling at the ends more than it usually did. And besides, Hiccup was quite sure that chasing Darin around all day, every day was no small feat regardless of the temperature. Her hair was likely the least of her worries. With this little guy, of course. "Ah yes," Adriana said, tapping Darin's nose. "Even the brightest light of my life makes me squint sometimes." Eric raised a brow. "I'm not sure I understand what that means." "It's okay, it was intended for small ears anyway." "I'm not sure Darin understands either, but it's fine." Darin's blue eyes had strayed to a nearby bush. He twisted sharply in Hiccup's arms in silent demand to be released. If he hadn't had such a good grip on his grandson's waist, he was quite sure the boy would have fallen head first. He set Darin down and they all watched in amusement as he dove into the bushes, clearly in search of something that had caught his eye. Adriana stretched out a hand but Eric held her back. He's all right. What if he gets bitten by something? Then we'll go to Mars and get a salve like last time. I'd prefer if we didn't have to make repeat trips to Mars, Adriana sighed. That bee sting was huge. Grinning slightly, Eric kissed Adriana's temple. He'll be fine. Though she rolled her eyes slightly, Adriana gave him a warm smile that lit up her green eyes. Even after 3 years of marriage, nothing seemed to dull their sparkle, Hiccup thought. Sure, there had been ups and downs. There always was in a marriage. But they still adored each other, and that made him happier than they could possibly know. Eric had taken on a lot of responsibility when he'd chosen the path he had. He'd had his whole life ahead of him and he'd chosen to give it to Adriana. He didn't see it as a sacrifice, but rather making the choice to love her and be by her side. It wasn't as if he hadn't already loved her. It only strengthened with that conscious decision and she'd then grown to trust him even more than she already did. With Darin, he was a natural. Hiccup had never seen a young man take to parenting as easily as he had, but with all his experience babysitting his many nieces and nephews, perhaps he just had enough experience to make it look easy. Regardless, the younger Hiccup in his mind trying to raise 2 infants at the same time was rather jealous. Adriana was no different. She was always meant to be a mother. She'd always loved babies and children from the time she was a little girl herself. There had been hard days with Darin, but she'd hit her stride. She too was a natural, and with Eric at her side it seemed nothing could sway them from the task set before them, loving each other and loving Darin. As Darin had grown older and they'd slowly built a new life as a family, every piece of the puzzle seemed to lock into place. This was right. Everything was exactly as it should be. In a way, it reminded Hiccup of his own marriage to Astrid all those years ago. He'd had a difficult time making the decision to stop gallivanting around the archipelago and set down some roots. It had taken much prodding by his father and other older counselors who only wanted what was best for their future chief. But it had taken Astrid's serious discussion to grab his attention at last. To really get him to really understand how much of a burden waiting was. Once they were married, it was almost a relief. Weddings were no small affair, but they two had been friends their entire life. They'd been in a close relationship for years and then dated for a few years. The next logical step in their relationship was to get married. Astrid had been right to wonder how one so smart, such as himself, could also be so dense. Still, after all these years he still loved Astrid with every fiber of his being. She was his best friend, his right arm, the first person he saw in the morning and the last he saw at night. He'd always be thankful that she was his and he was hers. Therefore, Hiccup could sympathize with his son, who was soon to be married. Waiting for an extended period of time to get married and not being able to change the circumstances was very frustrating. And Fearless Finn was not a patient man. Oh, he tried. He'd done his best. But nearly 3 years of engagement was finally starting to fray his nerves. Are you coming to the party on Friday? Adriana asked, cutting through Hiccup's thoughts. Yes, Hiccup replied. As is your mother. Good. Cliffy won't do with any of his besties not showing up, or so he says. As excited as I am for them, Eric said. It will be a blessed relief when the party's over. We've got a lot on our plates at the shop and the more he prattles, the less work he does. Well, you are the boss now. Adriana said. You can always tell him to. To what, exactly? Eric asked with a small smile. Tell Cliff to stop talking about the fact that his wife is about to give birth. You know how he gets under stress. Hiccup snorted. He'll be fine. They're going to be great parents. True, Eric said with a sigh. But still, I'm considering hiring another pair of hands. As more people graduate from dragon training, the more saddle orders come in. Summer is always our busiest season, but it's been crazy. Hiccup nodded. Horst had recently retired and given Eric the position as leather shop owner. It was a large change for his son-in-law, as he was now in charge of orders and finances and making sure the shop was well stocked and whatever else being a manager of a lucrative Burkean business entailed. Cliff was naturally his assistant, but he'd been very distracted lately. Taryn Smedley, Cliff's wife, was expecting their first child in less than a month. They were having a celebratory party later in the week at their new house. It was only insane to hiccup because time seemed to fly so quickly. It had just been yesterday when he'd seen all these little Rugrats running around the village and joining dragon training. Now they were all getting married and having babies of their own. Gods, he was getting old. Even Toothless seemed to be showing signs of age. He was still strong and mighty, both on the ground and in the air, but some of his scales had taken on a silvery sheen that Hiccup could only chalk up to age. As he still was the only Night Fury they'd ever seen, Hiccup couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness every time he thought about it. He didn't know how long Night Furies lived. All of his friends' dragons, including Stormfly, were all still going strong in age and strength. Dragons seemed to live long lives as humans did, based on the last 30 years of experience he had. He could only hope and pray he'd go before Toothless. He wasn't sure if he could handle that sort of loss. Darin emerged from the bush with leaves and sticks in his hair. He had his hands wrapped around a fat brown toad, which looked up at them with a nonplussed expression as Darin held it up. "Yuck! I found a froggy," "Oh," Adriana said with a pinched expression. "How nice, baby. Now you should eat it," a voice said. "Kissing frogs brings good luck, little man." They all looked up to see fearless Finn leaned against the side of a nearby house. He looked ruffled and tired, but his smile was no less endearing as Darin looked up and gasped. "Uncle Win. Wanna see?" "I do. Let me see." Finn crouched down so he was as close to eye with the toddler as possible. "Wow, you're going to be a great hunting man someday, aren't you?" "Aha. We get deers with." Darin looked around, momentarily distracted by a cart rolling by full of hay bales. He stuck up a grubby hand into Finn's face. 3 antlers. Wow, 3. That's intense. We probably should catch him, too. I'm sure all the other deers make fun of him for looking weird." Finn winked at Adriana and scooped Darin into his arms as he stood. "What do we say we let Mr. Froggy go?" "But I not kissed him yet." Adriana said, marching forward. "I was just kidding, but frogs are like girls." "Yucky. Yuck," Darin said and promptly threw the toad to the ground. It landed with a splat and quickly dashed into the bush once more. "Bye-bye. Poor thing." Adriana sighed. "You do love to teach my son the best life principles, Finn. Hey, he can kiss girls someday. Just not until he's at least 17. Says the boy who had his first kiss at 13 in front of the entire village," Hiccup drawled. "That wasn't my fault. She kissed me." "Hey, is that?" Eric frowned, twisting to the side to look at Finn closer. "You're bleeding." "Huh?" Finn twisted his free arm. His jacket was torn at the bicep where a bleeding gash could be seen. "Ah, well that's lovely. Here Anna, why don't you?" Adriana was already taking Darin, who was watching on with curious eyes. "How did you?" "Me and Zach took a tumble earlier. I guess I didn't notice that I got cut." Finn shrugged and lowered his arm. "It's fine, I'll clean it up later." "Are you sure?" Hiccup asked. "It looks deep." Finn waved a hand. "Seriously, I'm fine. We just got too carried away coming back from Jut." Hiccup wasn't sure what would entail getting carried away on almost 4 hours of ocean between Burke and Jut, but he didn't question it. Finn and Zach were prone to adventures. Besides, he worked a lot. If he found time away from work and wedding planning and traveling and everything else to have some fun with Zap, that was alright with him. Finn wasn't even chief yet and he was becoming a workaholic. "Speaking of," Adriana said with a sly grin. "How are wedding invitations coming in?" "Terra mail." "No, I mean how is it going?" "Gods. Fine," he said, running a hand through his red hair. "I think Jen counted 286 total last night. To be honest, it's kind of draining." "Which part?" "Invitations, counting guests, preparing for a wedding. Everything. Finn sighed. I'm just ready for it to be over, honestly. I mean, I'm excited obviously, he added quickly. It's just been a long time of talking about it and planning and talking about it and planning. I'm just ready for her to move here so we can get married, and the trips to Jut will be to visit her family, not each other. Adriana patted his arm. Give it a few weeks and then you won't have to worry about it anymore. Finn exhaled heavily. Yeah. Hiccup felt bad. He'd done everything he could to bump the wedding date up, but to no avail. His plans to convince Kiev otherwise had been thwarted. While he'd suggested that they get married once Finn turned 20, Kiev had insisted that this was only the beginning of adulthood, and therefore they must wait one more year. Molly had nodded firmly in agreement. So Finn and Genevieve had waited. After so much time waiting, the twins' 21st year was creeping up on them. They'd suddenly realized after the last snuggle talk that the wedding was in 6 months' time, and it had been a flurry of work ever since. And everyone in the archipelago wanted to be there for Fearless Finn's wedding. Hiccup knew Finn was excited, beyond excited really, but at the moment he just looked exhausted. He'd worked a long shift yesterday with the guards, which included a patrol of the entire island, and then traveled to Jut. Due to some meetings today that he couldn't miss, he'd had to be back today. It was a good thing his honeymoon was coming soon, too. He could use some time off of work. Eric seemed to have the same idea as he said, Kiev and Molly will regret putting this off as soon as you both start having kids. Then they'll realize they could have had a few more grandbabies by now. What is it? Finn said as they laughed. With everyone wanting me and Jen to have kids. One thing at a time, people. We just want Darren to have a playdate, that's all. Adriana said with a grin. Don't you, bud? He has plenty of those with Ava Thorsten. If he needs a playdate so badly, give him a brother. Or a sister to torment, you guys choose. Eric smiled and looked at Adriana as she scoffed, though Hiccup noticed she didn't look at her husband as she said, one can hardly choose the gender of their baby. No more can they choose the number, Hiccup added. With your luck, Addie, you'll have. Don't. Adriana lifted a hand and frowned through their laughter. Say twins. That joke was old 3 years ago. It's not that common besides. No, but it does run in the family apparently. What? It does? Finn asked in surprise. Who else had twins in our family? No, I mean it's hereditary. That's what I said. So who else had twins? I don't know, Finn. I don't know the whole family tree. Well, seeing as you're one of 3 male haddocks left if we're including Darren. That's poor leadership on your part. As Eric snickered, Hiccup sputtered. I dare say I've had more things on my mind the last 20 years than our deceased ancestors, Fearless Finn. You know, and that's another thing. Finn exclaimed, looking more awake by the second. I get at least 2 people from Jut asking me about my name every time I visit, and I don't have any stories on the man. I need more information. Who was Fearless Finn the first? Oh, why didn't you name him Fearless Finn the second? Adriana asked. That would have been interesting. No, because that would make the questions even worse. Dad, I need more info. Hiccup sighed. Go ask your mother. He wasn't my relative. No, but you knew him, right? Yeah, he was a nutjob who sailed a ship one direction and came back from the other. He got it into Tough Nut's head that the world is round, but I'm still convinced he just took a lap around the archipelago and made up a story to interest the kids. And yet he made such an impression on Mom to name me after him. Listen, kiddo. Hiccup said with an air of finality that he knew would drive his son bonkers. We had to decide between the names Stoic the Second, Hiccup Horrendous Haddock the Fourth, and Barney So. Eric and Adriana roared with laughter, drawing Darren's attention. He also began to laugh, though he likely didn't understand the joke. Finn's expression was mutinous. Come again. Yeah, that was Tough Nut's choice. I think it all started with Snotlout saying if I have a son, we should name him Bjorn, because a name that means bearfish would sound ridiculous. And then Tough Nut said we could call you Barney for short. Hiccup smirked at Finn's groan. Needless to say I was relieved when your mother came up with a better idea. Still want to complain about fearless Finn? No, no. I'm good. Thanks for that, Daddy. Adriana said, wiping at her eyes. I haven't laughed that hard in eons. I do what I can. Well, as much fun as this has been, Adriana sighed, looking up at Eric. I think it's time to head home. It's getting late and dinner time approaches. And bath time for Mr. Frogcatcher. For accuracy purposes, Eric said, reaching out to take Darin. It was a toad. Semantics. Eric grinned and turned so Darin could see the others. Say bye to Poppy and Uncle Finn. Darin's blue eyes were bright in the late afternoon light. I go with Poppy. Adriana stuck out her lower lip. I'm sorry, baby, but we need dinner and a bath. You're stinky. I'm not stinky. Darin said, crossing his arms smartly over his chest. It was such an Eric pose, Hiccup had to smother a laugh. I'll see you tomorrow, buddy. Hiccup said quickly. For now you have to go home, okay? Darin didn't look happy about this prospect. He'd forgotten how stubborn little kids could be. We'd better go before he has a meltdown. Adriana said under her breath and kissed his cheek. We'll see you both later. See ya. Hiccup and Finn watched as the Larsons walked down the street, which would lead to their house. Darin squirmed rebelliously in Eric's arms. He kept a firm hold, however, and launched into a skip that soon had the little boy laughing and holding on for dear life. Adriana trotted after them with a laugh until they disappeared. With a sigh, Hiccup glanced over at Finn. Despite their previous banter, he looked exhausted. His blue eyes lacked their usual sparkle. Why don't you head home, Finn? You look dead on your feet. Yeah, he reached up to rub his face. After the meeting I'm going to call it an early night. You don't have to be there. Hiccup said. It's just getting an update on everyone's patrols and reading off any important messages from the other chieftains. I shouldn't miss that stuff. No, but you don't need to fall asleep at the head table either. Hiccup glanced down at Finn's arm, which had long since stopped bleeding. You should get that looked at, too. Finn glanced down at it. It's fine, I'll patch it up. He chewed his lip for a moment. Are you sure you don't want me there? The fact that he did not argue about missing the meetings only proved Hiccup's point. We'll be fine, kiddo. Go home, get some rest. You've got a wedding in 3 weeks. You don't need to collapse with exhaustion leading up to it. A soft smile wormed its way onto Finn's face. Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye, kiddo. Finn trudged off towards the square. Zap had likely already gone to the ocean or the hatchery for her own dinner. Despite his exhaustion though, Finn straightened his spine as he walked through the crowded street and nodded and waved at anyone who greeted him. Nearly 21 and almost married. Hiccup felt a sharp pang of nostalgia for the days when his son had been Darin's age, running through the village on little legs and his blue eyes sparking with joy. He remembered the day not unlike this one when Finn had something in his mouth and he'd insisted that whatever it was, he needed to spit it out at once. Finn had opened his mouth and a frog had hopped out, eager for freedom. Hiccup chuckled. Whether it was the behavior of boys or strong haddock genes shining through, he'd never know, but some things never changed. The front door shut with a clap as Finn leaned into it heavily. He winced at the sound and closed his eyes, gently setting his head back against the old wood. The headache pounding behind his eyes seemed to grow with each breath he took. Though he'd tried to hide it, his father had seen right through it. Whether he realized his exhaustion was due to pulling another all-nighter, he didn't know. Probably not. If his dad had realized he'd been up for nearly 2 days straight, he'd have gotten a well-deserved earful. And yet there was so much to do. Exhaling, Finn opened his eyes to look around his house and smiled. It had only been a few months since he'd moved in, but it was starting to look more and more like a home every day. It just needed that feminine touch. This minor problem would be solved once Genevieve moved in, but for now it was practically a bachelor pad. Eric and Cliff and the other guys came over once a week for guys' night, no girls allowed, as Cliff put it. He'd only have 3 more of those nights until he got married. Well, unless Jen went to Adriana or Taryn's, which she likely would. He'd cross that bridge later, he supposed. He'd been talking about housing with Genevieve all throughout the last year. They'd been trying to figure out if they should buy a house or build a new one, like the Larsons and Smedleys had done. It wasn't uncommon to build a new one, but Finn had his eye on one house in particular for the better part of last summer. It had sustained some damage in the few years since it had been vacated. One elderly man had lived here a few years ago, but he'd passed away due to sickness last year. Finn had visited on more than one occasion, sometimes to remember, other times to consider if the house could perhaps be a new home in which he could build new memories. When he'd finally gotten the nerve to mention it to his parents, they'd both beamed at the prospect. They too had looked it over and agreed that it did need some repairs, but it was nothing that couldn't be fixed. It was a good size, the yard was big enough to build a barn and build onto the house if they ever needed to, and his dad suspected they would once kids came along. It was the perfect house for any single young man about to bring his new bride home. And thus, Benen's old home became Finn's new home. It had been strange those first few weeks living on his own. It was a strange change in pace anyway, but he'd spent so much time in this house as a boy. He'd made memories with Benen here. They'd baked cookies in the kitchen, had sleepovers in sleeping bags on the floor and made puppet shadows on the ceiling in candlelight, whittled for hours on the porch while Benen told him stories of his former life. He'd laughed at the jokes Benen made and wept when he'd shared his darkest fears, admitting to struggling with his anger at how Rattray had mistreated him. The guilt had been harder to admit. Benen had been more than a mentor. He'd been an encourager, a gentle soul who'd been dealt a horrible hand of cards in the game of life. And yet he'd chosen to be happy. He savored every sunrise, every sunset, every free breath his lungs could take in. He remembered the day the Haddocks had revealed the house to Benen, explaining that it was bought and paid for. Benen wept. It was his first establishment to call his own in decades. And remembering this, Finn had struggled with his own emotions the day he'd moved in. He hoped he wouldn't cry when Genevieve moved in after their wedding. That would be horribly embarrassing. That was not the appropriate response to bringing home your bride. No, after 3 years of waiting to get married, he had other plans for that night. Smiling, Finn toed off his boots and hung up his jacket. He frowned at the hole in the sleeve he'd now have to mend. Getting the blood out of the material would be harder. Scowling at the tear in both his shirt and his skin, he quickly made a fire and put on a kettle of water. He still wasn't a massive fan of leaf water, or tea as his beloved called it, but he needed something to ease the headache. If he went to bed with it, it would likely linger through tomorrow. Hopping up onto the counter, Finn stripped off his shirt and inspected his arm. Dried blood crumbled away at his touch. The cut stung as he washed the wound and wrapped a bandage around it. He probably needed stitches, but he didn't care at the moment. He'd having a look at it tomorrow if it started hurting. Hopefully it wouldn't. If it did and he had to talk to Inga, she'd have questions, and he'd rather avoid those, too. It was hard enough brushing off his father and sister and brother-in-law, all of whom were no pushovers. If his mother caught wind of the injury, she'd never let it go. Sighing, he glanced over at the kettle, but the water didn't seem to be hot enough. Apparently making it too hot was a problem as well, depending on the tea. He could never seem to get it right. According to Genevieve, tea was an art form, one that she was slowly teaching him. Or trying to, rather. It was better when she made it anyway. He'd gladly drink all the tea in the world if she could live with him now. 3 weeks. He could wait 3 more weeks. Finn stretched back atop his counter, uncaring that he was surrounded by dirty plates, bowls and cups that he hadn't had time to wash. Normally he'd never allow himself to become such a slob, but he'd been busy. He closed his eyes and resolved to wait 2 more minutes for the water to heat before giving in. In the silence of the empty house, his mind processed everything that had happened in the last 2 days. Regular strolls through the village to keep an eye on things, an hour in the forge clanging at the anvil as Vidar Jorgensen boasted about how he'd taken Finn's place without effort. Forge work is in the Jorgensen blood, you know, reconnaissance with Zap around the island, meetings in the Great Hall, flying to Jet and spending the day with Genevieve. And then their long flight exploring last night that had ended with her sitting in his lap, his hands deep in her hair as she kissed him senseless. They'd done well for the most part to keep their hands to themselves, especially when they were alone. Especially as their wedding approached, but he knew his self-control was beginning to fray like a well-worn piece of rope. It was almost better when they made their displays of affection public for all to see. Kisses in public could be chaste and sweet and endearing. The real danger lay in the kisses stolen in quiet corners or in the wild as they traveled. It would be a blessed relief when they were finally married and they wouldn't have to think about it anymore. When their oaths were sealed and their promises bound into their souls before the gods and their kinsmen. Already she'd started to move in. The closet in the master bedroom was full of clothes and the washroom had started to accumulate hair clips and ties, makeup, lotions, and a small dish for her rings and other jewelry, as well as a wicker basket for her shampoos and perfumes and bath salts. Her furniture and other things that she couldn't bring on Max would be brought by ship the week before the wedding as the Jatans started to arrive. Things were all starting to come together. She'd hinted at one final gift she'd be bringing on her next trip to Berk, but he wasn't sure exactly what it would be. The excited glow in her dark eyes was gift enough in his opinion. Her excitement was palpable. 3 weeks. 3 weeks and all the waiting will have been worth it. Still, 3 weeks. Memories of her mouth, the press of her body against his, her hands running across his chest and shoulders weren't hard to conjure up. The gasp that came from her throat as his teeth scraped her collarbone had been nearly enough to undo him altogether, but somehow he'd managed it. Even though his blood pulsed for more. Finn became aware of a high-pitched whistling sound that slowly interrupted the silence. Cracking his eyes open, he found the kettle was finally ready. He slowly sat up, muscles straining with exhaustion, and grabbed the tin of tea bags that Genevieve saved for relaxation. They'd made it this far. He could make it another 3 weeks. Hell, maybe it would be easier if they didn't see each other until the wedding day. That wasn't a half-bad idea, though he didn't want to go without seeing her for all that time. But it would eliminate any temptation. Stop thinking and drink your tea. Finn sighed heavily. And now I'm talking to myself. The next 3 weeks had better go by quickly or he might just go mad before he could marry her. And he couldn't have that. After all this time waiting, he had plans for that girl, and his father had a point. He didn't need to collapse at any time beforehand. So for now he'd drink his tea. He'd go to bed early. He'd take a break from some of his duties. He'd get himself a calming elixir from Mara and Inga if he had to. He'd do whatever it took to get a grip before the wedding. Because afterward, he wanted to be awake for every moment of his new life with Genevieve Sullivan, soon to be Genevieve Haddock. The knife in Adriana's hands rose and fell in quick succession as she chopped strawberries. The sound of splashing echoed from the washroom as Eric gave Darin a bath. She hid a smile at the sound of her husband teasingly scolding their son about splashing. She was quite sure there was more water on the floor than anything else. She scooped up the strawberries and dropped them into a pot. Adding a healthy amount of sugar, she set it to hang over the fire and began chopping vegetables. She didn't care that the carrots would have strawberry juice on them. Normally she'd wipe the board, but she needed to get the veggies boiling sooner rather than later, or they'd still be raw by the time the chicken was done roasting. A few short years ago she wouldn't have known how to make dinner. Finn had taught her how to make eggs when they were 16, but outside that she'd never cooked. Only baked. Eric had cooked more often than she did after they got married. She'd been so hugely pregnant and he was proficient at the skill. But after Darin had been born and she got used to that new track of life, she'd insisted on learning. They shared various chores and it worked for them, but she genuinely wanted to learn. When more kids came along, she needed to know how to feed them. Especially since Eric was working more hours. Yes, she worked all day as well watching Darin and doing other things with friends and family, but it wasn't the same as managing a shop in the village. If he worked 8 hours, he didn't need to cook dinner as well. Not if she was fully capable. Though he still insisted at times. He claimed it got his mind off of work and gave her an opportunity to sit down. It provided them the time to talk, too. It worked out well for them. The pitter-patter of small feet echoed down the hall and Darin emerged. His hair had been tousled dry with a towel, similar to how Eric dried his own, so it stuck up in all directions. He was adorable in his white pajamas with little dragons on them. How Morgan had managed to get the dragons onto the material, she'd never know, but she'd become quite the seamstress. Darin, Don't touch the pot. Adriana said quickly as he stood on tiptoes to peer inside it. It's hot. Okay mama. Darin pointed. It's hot. Yes, please don't touch it. You'll get hurt. No more boo-boos, right? Right, mama. No more boo-boos. Darin spotted the family cat Mittens sitting in a patch of sunlight nearby and darted toward him. Eric emerged moments later, water droplets all over his light blue shirt. He'd rolled his shirt sleeves up his forearms but they too were damp with water. Looks like you two had quite the adventure. Adriana said, refocusing on the carrots she was chopping with precise movements. Each chop sent a loud clang through the house. Yup, we were visiting an underwater city called Atlantis. Where Cliff gets these ideas I'll never know, but Darin seems quite taken with it. As long as he doesn't ask to visit on his next birthday, we'll manage. Adriana kept her eyes on the vegetables and knife, but she could feel Eric's eyes on her. How was work? Same as always. Eric stepped closer. Busy. Nothing too interesting. Be careful, you're going to hack your fingers off. I'm just trying to get it done quickly because it's so loud. I hate cutting vegetables. Do you want me? No, I got it. It will be loud either way. True. Eric leaned against his forearms and continued watching. His blue eyes flicked between her hands and her face every few seconds. What? Adriana asked. Is there something on my face? No. I'm just watching. I know, it's weird. Why? I like watching you work. Adriana rolled her eyes. Can't I chop veggies without getting grief? Grief? Who said anything about grief? With a small smirk, Eric reached out and pulled on a strand of her hair that had fallen out of its bun. I think it's kind of hot actually. The way you handle knives. Scoffing, Adriana lifted the cutting board and shoved all the carrots, celery, and potatoes into another pot. Can you fill this with water? Sure. Eric straightened but didn't move away. He was still looking at her. Choosing to ignore this, Adriana turned away to check on the berries and sugar that were surely turning into a syrupy concoction. She needed it for the biscuits that were currently rising on the countertop beneath a hand towel, and she still needed to make whipped cream. A pair of warm arms slid around her waist and she inhaled in surprise when Eric pulled her close into his chest. He dropped his chin onto her shoulder. What's wrong? Trying to ignore his closeness, Adriana grabbed a wooden spoon and stirred the berries. Nothing. Are you sure? You seem irritated about something. Was she? Sure, she was in the middle of making dinner and she'd overdone it a little bit by wanting to make a dessert, too. She didn't feel particularly frazzled however. No, but he was right. She did feel a little testy. Talk to me. I don't know. Eric's mouth ghosted her ear as he said, well, it's got to be something. A flare of temper rose up in her and she promptly pushed backward into his chest, trying to push him off, but his arms were still around her waist. Stop. Let go. Eric paused for only a second before he let his arms drop. He stepped around her and gave her a concerned look. Annie. Adriana huffed. It's fine, just go see what Darin's doing. Probably drowning the cat. What did I do? Are you mad at me for something? To his credit, he merely looked surprised and confused. Truth be told though, Adriana wasn't sure exactly what her problem was. But she did know that the more he needled her, the more irritated she was becoming. Adriana took a fortifying breath and forced herself to look him in the eyes. I don't know. I'm having a moment or something. Eric pursed his lips. Big moment. I'm just not in the mood right now, okay? You've been fawning all over me all day, and I'm just not feeling it. And there it was, she thought. She hadn't meant to say it, or even considered it. But he'd been cuddly and affectionate and staring at her all day, and she just wasn't in the mood. Not for cuddling or affection or anything that might entail. He wasn't even necessarily asking for anything, but when he got super affectionate, sometimes one thing led to another, and she just wasn't feeling it today. Any of it. Eric gave her a sheepish smile. Oh. Okay. I'll leave you alone, then. He gave her an awkward smile and lifted the pot of vegetables to no doubt fill with water as she'd asked. In the few moments of awkwardness, she'd forgotten all about it. He disappeared out the back door where the well was located and she was left in silence, except for Darren's toddling about in the living room. Adriana set her wooden spoon down into the pot with a clang, frustrated. But who was she frustrated with more? Eric or herself? Why was she frustrated with him? He asked if he'd done something to upset her, but she couldn't think of anything in particular. In fact, things had been great lately. His new position had forced him to work more, but they'd already gotten past that. No, that wasn't it. Adriana thought back as she picked up the wooden spoon and began stirring again. A part of her thought that it wasn't a big deal to not be in the mood, it wouldn't be the first time. It wasn't a crime, and Eric certainly never pushed her. The other part of her thought back to the last time they'd been together in an amorous setting and... She paused. When was the last time? She couldn't remember. It must have been some time if she'd forgotten all about it. That would also explain his clinginess. Eric wasn't a clingy person, doting and devoting, yes, but not clingy. But if it had been a long time, perhaps he just missed her. That also wasn't a bad thing. She should feel flattered. A part of her did. But that feeling of mute frustration built inside her. Why? Darren toddled into the kitchen, momentarily distracting her from her musings. He had a square block and was trying to fit it into a star-shaped hole. She watched him struggle for a long moment and was about to help him when he dropped them both and disappeared around a corner, clearly finished with the ordeal. The back door opened and Eric returned. He set the pot hanging over the fire with a small placating smile before he went looking for Darren as the sound of crashing sounded from one of the spare closets. She instantly felt bad that he felt the need to even give her a placating smile, but she couldn't do anything about it. Not while she still didn't know why she was frustrated. And by extension potentially avoiding him. She wasn't avoiding him perhaps, but she could remember a few times now in the last few weeks when she'd brushed him off. Maybe it had taken so many times for her to realize it, but she hadn't been in the mood for a while. Frowning, Adriana sprinkled salt into the pot of vegetables. Maybe she should ask him. He couldn't read minds, but he knew her pretty well. Maybe he could figure out what her problem was. But that wasn't fair, not after he'd decided to give her space, after she'd rudely shoved him away. He seemed to understand when she said she wasn't in the mood. What would happen when she wasn't in the mood tomorrow though? Or the next day? Or next week? Adriana sighed and tossed the hand towel aside that had been covering the biscuits. Maybe she really should ask him. After all, they talked about everything together and obviously their love life was theirs to share. Which they did. And if they ever hoped to have more kids someday. The word if clanged through her and she nearly dropped the pan of biscuits into the stone oven. In doing so, she burned a few fingers. Recoiling with a yelp, she shook out her hand and winced at the welts already forming before plunging her entire hand into a nearby bucket of cool drinking water. "Are you okay?" Eric asked, appearing moments later. "Did you burn yourself?" "Yeah," Adriana said tightly. "Clumsy. I'll get that salve from Mara. She said it helps with burns, too." Adriana nodded and watched him go as he disappeared through the washroom door. She finally knew what was frustrating her. It wasn't him exactly. It was no one in particular. And that's what made all the difference. There was something about the atmosphere and ambience of a tavern that Alton loved. Perhaps it was the dim lights, the card games, the weathered sailors and fishermen cackling over ale, or the music that always played from some corner. Harps, lyres, penny whistles, drums, there was always something, just as there was always stew and cheap ale. The cheap ale he could do without. The stew was warm, however, and he accepted it gratefully from the barmaid as she slid it toward him. The sourdough bread was better. He and Johan had been caught in a wicked storm for an entire day and he still felt waterlogged with cold. The tavern was full to near bursting with fishermen and sailors, all sharing stories around the fire pit. He kept the hood on his cloak pulled over his head, partially to retain extra warmth. Some of these people weren't fond of the Nordmanners, as those in the archipelago were called. Alton didn't know Latin, but it didn't take him long to figure that one out. With Johann's coloring and dark hair, he could easily pass off as someone from the mainland, but nobody saw Alton as anything but pure barbarian. Not that he acted like one. That was just the stereotype. If you were born in the north and lived on an island, you were obviously a barbarian. He was just glad he didn't have his own pet dragon. If he did, he and Johann would never sell anything. Except, perhaps, the dragon. Alton was just sipping his watery ale, wishing for something better like Gobber's homemade wine, when he heard it. Had me by the throat with a dagger, brighter than the full moon itself. Thought I was a dead man, so I did. Alf, it was probably one of your mates pulling a prank. I'm telling ya lads, it was him. One man's laughter was like a blade against a whetstone. What's that? The mysterious Knight Rider. Alton took a casual bite of his stew but strained to hear over the noise. Aye, that's what he looked like. All dressed in black and... Ya always were a superstitious old goat, Alf. Need I remind you, Elf said crossly, that we were within leagues of the archipelago. That dragon-loving king's realm. He's no king. Another man scoffed. Just another chieftain o' one of the islands. Well, he practically rules like a king from what I hear. Probably kills anyone who gets too close to his territory, another muttered. Him and his nightmarish night fury. Alton stifled a laugh. If only these men knew that Toothless acted like a house cat most days. But that's what I'm telling ya, lads. Alf started up again. I saw no one approaching the ship. There were no beasts in the air or in the water. The night was dark as pitch. How did the Knight Rider get on the ship at all? What if he lowered his voice so much that Alton barely heard it? What if it was him? The chief himself? What would he want with a slave ship? Alton's brows shot upward. I haven't the foggiest. He was silent as the dead though, I tell ya. He was right disappointed though. What's that? Alf made a face and leaned closer to the others. He wanted to know how many were on the ship. Didn't want my throat spilled on the deck, so I told him the number of the crew, including the captain. Then he said he didn't care for the crew, only the heads below decks. Alf smirked. He meant slaves. The others' expressions were a mixture of shock and interest. So it was him. It was the Knight Rider. How did you survive? From what I've heard, he's left a smoke trail in his wake. Well, that's the thing, Alf said. Ship was empty. No slaves aboard. When I said we'd be picking up our next shipment in Mayro, he sounded angry. Next thing I know, he bashes me over the head and I'm waking to the captain giving me an earful hours later. Thought I fell asleep at my post, so he did. It's for that reason only that I'm glad I have a goose egg on the back of my head, or else he wouldn't have believed me. And you'd have been fed by those pesky sea dragons anyway. The men snickered into their mugs and jeered. Oh, laugh all you want, lads. Alf said, standing. You just pray that if the Knight Rider attacks you in the night, you have no slaves aboard your ships. He might kill you otherwise. The men muttered amongst themselves as Alf left. Alton watched him go from the corner of his eye until the door swung shut behind him. Peering down into his half-empty mug, Alton mulled over everything that he'd heard. So there was a vigilante dragon rider attacking slave ships. And the slavers and sailors had dubbed him the Knight Rider. Interesting. The thought of Hiccup being the mysterious vigilante made Alton snort. Hiccup had freed Benin from slavery all those years ago, but somehow Alton didn't think he'd make it his mission to antagonize the slave trade. Not when they were doing their absolute best to keep the slave trade out. Still, he'd have to mention these whispers to Hiccup in his next letter. He'd be most interested to know the information. With their luck, it was someone posing as a Viking from the archipelago, and it would only come back to bite his people later. Alton had been traveling the seas with Johann for a few years now. In perhaps another year he'd be taking over the trading business, as Johann planned to retire and live out the rest of his days on Berk, his favorite of the Archipelagan Islands. He said this to most every village they set foot on. Of course, it encouraged people to loosen the strings on their coin purses, but Berk truly was his favorite. The trading business had been interesting at best, tedious at worst. Since the chieftains Ali of Outcast Island and Grey of Rune revealed their plot with the slave trade, each chieftain and their heirs had spent hours upon hours coming up with protection strategies to defend against slavers. This meant that Johan and Alton needed to go on a strict travel route so they weren't attacked by friends. Mainly they traveled the route and flew a particularly colored flag to show their allies they meant no harm. Combined with the familiar colors of Johan's flag and shields lining his ship, any on patrol would quickly realize who they were and move on. Poor Johan had not taken the changes to his schedule lightly. He was older now and set in his ways. It had been Alton himself who'd convinced him that this was all for the best. It was better than his life's work sinking to the bottom of the ocean by dragonfire, and losing his life to boot. Traveling to Jut was the most difficult part of any journey because it took so long to get there, but they made up for it in wares. Handmade instruments, intricately crafted weapons and clothing and jewelry, gems and precious metals and jams and fruits and vegetables and more. If Alton didn't love Berk so much as his home, he'd seriously consider moving to Jut. As it was, he had more than a few reasons for Berk to remain his one and only home. Pushing aside his empty bowl, Alton pulled out a carefully folded letter from his breast pocket and smoothed it out against the counter. A familiar script greeted him and, though he'd already read it 1,000 times, he did so again. Alton. Enough is enough. I've about had it with your gallivanting across the archipelago. You never take time for me anymore, and it's really starting to show. I'm going to be an old lady by the time you return, and what then? Will you smooch an old lady? I hope not, that's gross. Obviously I'm joking. I mean I'm serious about the old lady thing, but I'm kidding about the rest of it. Mostly. When are you coming back? You've been gone since January. You'd better be back in time for Finn and Genevieve's wedding, because I've been staving off boys with a stick for months as they keep asking to go to the wedding with me, and I keep telling them that I'm spoken for. What do I need to do? Get a betrothal necklace from you before people take a hint. That was totally a joke. Mostly. Seriously though, you need to come home soon. I miss you. I know I don't say it enough, but it's true. Someday I'll go gallivanting across the archipelago with you, and I'll learn new ways to heal people, and we'll get fat and old together on the high seas. But for now, you need to come back to me while I'm still young and gorgeous. Because seriously, you're missing out, buddy. Come back to me soon. Love. Inga. Alton stared down at the little heart she'd drawn next to the word soon. He found himself grinning like a fool, but he didn't care. She was perhaps the only person who could put so much sarcasm into a letter and not be offensive. She was also the only person that had ever kept him up at night, made him smile like this, made him act like an absolute fool. Gods help him, he loved her. Not that he had the guts to tell her in so many words. After 2.5 years of dating and so many breaks in between, he wondered how she hadn't gone mad with exhaustion yet. After all, long-distance dating was no picnic. Indeed, she was probably legitimately annoyed with him by now though. He received this letter nearly a week ago and he still hadn't replied. His terrible Terra Maybell was starting to get annoyed with him, too. But what could he say? How could he reply to such a sarcastic yet endearingly sweet message without putting more on paper than he should? When the things he wanted to say needed to be said in person. Sighing, Alton folded the letter back up and put it back in his breast pocket. He and Johan were planning to be back in time for Finn and Genevieve's wedding. It was only a few weeks away. Perhaps he should just wait, rather than risk saying too much. But to make her wait almost a month for a response by that point seemed particularly cruel. She'd start to worry, too. The world was big and unsafe after all. What else would she think? Boy, and then if she found out when she found out that he took weeks to reply. Oh, then he'd really get it. The door to the tavern swung open and a large group of burly men in black clothing strode in, laughing and shoving each other. Many bore weapons and armor, but Alton hardly noticed any of that. He always sized up anyone who entered just to gauge any troublemakers, anyone who had sticky fingers. Being a part of the trading business meant he had valuable goods, which meant he didn't need anyone noticing the money he carried, let alone following him back to his ship. Nothing of interest caught his eye, so Alton returned to his mead. He fought a grimace, wondering how on earth anyone could drink this and enjoy it when the door swung open again. And Brandine Anderson walked in. Alton subtly pulled the hood of his cloak lower. Despite his pounding heart as he watched Brandine's blue eyes take a sweep of the room at large, Alton kept his muscles loose and unbothered. He didn't want Brandine to notice he was here. And if he was lucky. Brandine strode through the room toward the large group of burly black-clad men, his brown hair darkening in the low light. It was only then that Alton noticed Donna perched atop one of the tables. Her red hair was cut at a sharp angle along her jawline and dark kohl swept her eyelids. She looked wicked and dangerous as always. Donna gave Brandine a slow smile, but he only half-heartedly nodded back. He took a seat beside one of the largest men and launched into a low discussion that unfortunately didn't carry. The comfortable ambience in the tavern had long since passed. The noise had now risen to almost uncomfortable levels. What was Brandine doing here? This fishing village was leagues away from the archipelago, that could spell either good news or bad news. On the one hand, he was far from the haddocks. Good riddance. Maybe he'd set down some roots far away, rotten as anything. But that was wishful thinking, judging by the troop of burly soldiers that all looked to him with respect and leadership. Alton tapped his fingers against the counter, wondering what to do. Somehow he doubted he could leave the tavern without Brandine noticing, or at least one of his cronies. He was good at keeping a low profile, but the room was bustling with activity. Brandine's men were keeping an eye on everyone present, as they too were being watched. The barman in particular was watching them closely as if expecting a brawl. Alton blinked and a slow smile stretched across his face. If there was one way he could get out of here unnoticed, it's if there was so much chaos that one couldn't keep track of every possible thing. Gods, forgive me for what I must do. And without thinking twice, Alton slid his foot out while a waiter walked by carrying a large tray of drinks toward the burliest of warriors. He went down with a yell and a crash. Ale and wine sprayed everywhere, dousing more than half of the warriors. Shouting and cursing erupted as the men began shouting at the waiter, then at each other. By the time anyone looked around to see what the man claimed to have tripped on, the door was swinging shut behind him. Alton allowed himself a second of victory but knew he wasn't free yet. The sooner he got back to Johann's ship and got as far away from this village, the better. Then he'd send a message to Hiccup. The night was dark. The streets had long since cleared of fishing merchants, leaving the hot summer air reeking with the smell of fish oil and scales and seaweed. Normally it would remind him of home and he'd reminisce for at least a moment, but not now. It was times of urgency like this that he wished he had a dragon. He quickened his pace and didn't stop for anything. A few drunks staggered down the street and called out to him, but he ignored them. He passed a tall building that stood out like a beacon on the street. Half a dozen women stood on the porch, all dressed in various forms of revealing clothing. One reached out to him as he walked by, but he brushed her off and kept moving. This was dangerous territory on a good day. He turned another corner and without warning, a solid mass collided with him from above. Alton collapsed beneath the weight of someone who'd clearly jumped off the nearest roof and struggled to shake them off. He didn't have time or patience to be mugged right now. Well, a familiar female voice crooned in his ear. If it isn't Baby Brand. So far away from home, like a lost little bird. Donna. Get off of me. Alton hissed, hardly able to breathe. He felt more than saw Donna's smile. I do love it when boys say that. It gives me such a rush. Donna, let him up. Alton shut his eyes against the voice and resisted a filthy curse word that would have his mother washing out his mouth with soap no matter his age. Donna gave a disappointed sniff and obeyed. Alton struggled to his hands and knees before getting to his feet. He didn't bother brushing the dirt and pebbles from his clothing, though he did put a hand to his cheek. It was bleeding, but not much. Brandine was standing not 10 feet away from him, flanked by 2 of the burly guards. Both were sopping wet and looked angry. Brandine smiled though. Long time no see, Alton. That was quite a little show you put on back there. Poor Martin's likely going to be fired. Alton took a deep breath and shrugged with nonchalance he didn't feel. Wrong place at the wrong time and all that. Indeed. Which is no doubt what you're thinking for yourself, right? Brandine shoved his hands into his pockets. Actually, I'd like to congratulate you. You're right on time. Alton frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Brandine said, taking a single step closer, as did his men and Donna. Alton took a step back. We've been waiting for you. We know all about your little trade route set up by the chieftains. We knew you and Johann would show up eventually. We need some information. What sort of information do you think I could give you? Alton asked. I'm a tradesman, not a chieftain. Hell, I'm not even a soldier or a dragon rider. And neither is Johann. That's what makes my job so much easier. Brandine said with a low laugh. Alton felt a rush spread from his chest through his limbs. This meeting hadn't been a coincidence. They knew he'd be here. Well, he might not be a warrior or have a dragon, but he was from Berk. He was still a fighter and he was smart. He'd been here 100 times and knew these streets like the back of his hand. If he could lose them and get to Johann's ship. As if sensing his thoughts, Donna shot forward. She was fast, but Alton was expecting it this time. He twisted out of her way, only grunting when her hands fisted in his cloak. He snapped off the clip around his neck and tore down the nearest street, leaving it behind. Heavy footsteps echoed behind him, but he easily outpaced them. The two burly soldiers were heavy, they'd knock him flat in one hit. If they could catch him. But Brandine and Donna. Alton hissed as his feet hit a patch of gravel and he slammed into the nearest wall. A water trough blocked the end of the small alley. He leaped it and kept going. The footfalls skidded to a halt with grunts of pain and cursing. The bigger men had collided in the narrow alley and now had to waste time freeing themselves. Brandine wasn't far behind him though. Donna had likely taken to the roofs again. Glancing upward, Alton found her keeping pace with him with the flat roofs of the fishing village. Gritting his teeth, he took a sharp left into the nearest dark alley. Try and squash him flat again, did she? Now she'd be on the wrong street altogether. Sharp as the turn had been, Brandine had to check his speed to not face-plant into the nearest walls. He lost precious seconds as Alton sprinted down the street and across the next. His lungs burned with each breath, but he could make it. The docks were just a street away. He could hear the gulls and terrors and smell the sea. In fact, he'd be able to hear Johann's whistling any second now. Gasping, Alton sprinted out of the narrow alley and nearly collided with a pair of guards. They gave a shout and demanded that he halt, but he didn't dare. They could stop Brandine. He was the raging sociopath. The ship loomed up ahead. Johann! Alton shouted. Raise the anchors now. Now. I'd love to, lad. Johann's sad voice came from the docks and Alton slid to a halt. But I'm afraid we aren't going anywhere. Johann was on his knees surrounded by a dozen men, all dressed in black, weapons drawn. His hands were tied with thick rope that chafed against his weathered skin. Clearly he'd been trying to escape. A trickle of blood slid from his split lip into his beard. That's when Alton saw the blockade of ships in the harbor. Even if Johann hadn't been captured, even if they'd managed to get the ship underway, they would have been stopped anyway. No. Alton whispered. Please, lad. Johann's eyes were imploring. Run. Save yourself. And where exactly is he going to go, Johann? Brandine's panting voice said. Alton turned hateful eyes on the man who'd made his friends' lives a living hell. He wanted nothing more than to kill him now, but knew he'd never be strong enough. That was a job for better men. But no matter what happened next, he would not break. Come quietly, Brandine said in a slow voice, as if talking to a child. And nobody needs to get hurt. Whatever you're planning, Alton said in an even tone. It won't work. You won't win. Brandine's mouth stretched into a smile, throwing the scar on his face into sharp relief against the moonlight. But you don't even know my master plan yet. Maybe, Alton said. But I don't need to. Twisting on his heel, Alton sprinted not toward the empty streets or the fishing village, but toward the ship. Johann shouted as the guards ran forward, but he managed to dodge them all. Burly men were so easy to avoid. He knew he wouldn't get far, but he had to get a message to Berk, had to get to Maybelle. Something struck the nearest wooden post and it shattered. Alton jerked away with his arms over his face, but still felt splinters embed into his skin in a few places. Johann shouted again and his training with Astrid as a boy kicked in as he rolled, barely dodging the mace that nearly impaled him from behind. Pain seized up Alton's hands as he crawled back. More of Brandine's guards were advancing. There were too many. He'd never get to his cabin in time to write a letter, even a short one. He'd never get to tell Inga what was in his heart. A small and yet fierce warrior's cry sounded and a small, pinpoint ball of fire erupted in front of the soldiers. They cried out in shock as their boots began to melt. A purple terrible terror roared and clawed the air at them, warning them to back away. Maybelle! Alton shouted. He snatched her off the ground and took off running down the docks. Heavy footfalls pounded after them but he didn't dare stop. His hands and face were bleeding and his chest hurt, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was that she got back to Berk to warn them. Get to Berk, tell them Brandine is coming. Find Inga and you tell her. Without warning, Alton threw her into the air at the end of the docks. Maybelle screeched in dismay and tried to fly back. No. Get to Berk, Maybelle. Go get help. Go. Alton shouted. Then the soldiers were clapping firm hands on his neck and shoulders, forcing him to his knees. Alton fought with every ounce of strength he had left, but it was no use. He simply wasn't strong enough. Still, he peered up through his bangs and saw Maybelle flying as fast as she could away from the island. Toward the north. To Berk. To Inga. Shoot her down. Brandine shouted. No. Alton struggled, but one of the men pressed a knee into his back and he was effectively stuck, even as others held down his arms and legs. Arrows rose and fell, disappearing into the ocean, but Maybelle dodged them all. A burst of fire erupted and she burned others to a crisp. But she kept going, kept going, kept going. Until she disappeared into the darkness. Tears slipped down his face even as he tried to force them back. He didn't care if they thought he was weak or crying from the pain or fear. Maybe all of that was true. But seeing his last hope disappear on the horizon was so terrifying, he thought he'd be sick. No matter, Brandine's voice said overhead. There was no message attached. And no matter how hard Hiccup tries and pretends, he can't understand dragons as well as he says. Underestimating him was always your first mistake, same as your father's. We should cut out his tongue, sir. One of the brutes crouching over him said. He's got a mind of his own and I don't like it. If he has no tongue, then he cannot talk, and if he cannot talk then he is of no use to me, Roscoe Brandine said in a tone that said they'd had this discussion before. Alton shook with suppressed rage. If you're going to kill me, then do it. I've made my peace. Brandine snorted and ordered the men to their feet while Roscoe tied Alton's hands behind his back. Once he was standing, Brandine grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and yanked him closer. Oh, your time will come, baby Brand, as it will for all of us. But first, we have some things to discuss about our wonderful archipelago. Chapter 2, Dying Wishes. Chapter text. The shattered screams of dying men were music to Anton's ears. Sweet, sweet music. Not the shattered screams that accompanied death. No, death was a mercy. Death was a welcome embrace to end the suffering he so tastefully wrought about and relished. No, these were the screams of tortured souls. These men, women and children who had lost everything. Family. Husbands, wives, children, parents, and more. Homes. Some peaceful, others barbaric. The nature of the home, the culture, meant nothing. Everyone had a home. Everyone had a home to lose. Freedom. Every man was born free, until he wasn't. Every man had arms, legs, teeth and tongue, all of which to offer service to those greater than they. Greater than they would ever be. Regardless of race, gender, cultural background. Everyone had their gods they cried out to. Pled with. Wept to. None of them answered. Perhaps that's what made them all equal in his eyes. The sheer hopelessness that all men suffered. Every man who was born had a single destiny. Death. It was the inevitable end of every man's life. How he lived out his days, whom he spent it with, living either morally right or wrong, none of it mattered. His life meant next to nothing. Oh, it held value. His work and profits weren't meaningless. But he was like a copper in a wealthy man's velvet-lined pocket. Easily expendable, easily forgotten, but gathered together by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, he had intrinsic value. While their pointless weeping and gnashing of teeth and sorrow and rage and emptiness were all music to his ears, there was very little that caused him more pleasure than breaking the strongest, the fearless. There was something so intensely satisfying in watching a proud, arrogant man fall to his knees in humble submission. The shame on his face as his people bowed in turn. Broken. Submissive. Dead. Alive. Breathing. But dead. The door to his study groaned open on rusty hinges, interrupting the moans and weeping echoing from outside. Slaver Anton glanced up from his book as a trio of individuals stalked into the room. He took quick stock of the tall, broad-shouldered man, the woman with lank, dirty blonde hair, and the well-muscled young man standing between them. Not protecting him, as some parental figures did. He was leading them. Slaver Anton's lips twitched. Brandine Anderson. He turned his gaze back to his book and dropped a leather bookmark between the pages. I wondered when you would grace me with your presence. The boy threw back his hood with a quick flick of his wrist. His dark hair framed cool, calculating blue eyes. A red scar slashed down the right side of his face from his chin to his brow. Complete with the berserker crest tattooed onto the left side of his neck, he looked nearly identical to his late father. A far cry from the boyish lad who'd walked into his study nearly 10 years ago, brimming with ideas and schemes and fantasies of the devious kind. I've come to collect on our bargain, Brandine said, cutting right to the chase. So unlike his father in that regard. Would you care for a drink? I don't have time for games, Brandine said as Anton stood and poured himself a glass of wine from a decanter. Unlike you, I've got work to do. Anton chuckled and sipped his wine. Yes, you and your endless work. How long has it been since you've taken a day off? I suspect, before you fled Burke with your tail tucked between your legs, yes. A muscle ticked in Brandine's jaw. Anton smiled and took another sip of his wine. It's not his fault things fell apart. The woman, Ali of Outcast Island, said as she too threw off her hood. Hiccup got the jump on us. If it weren't for Lofen, the plan would have worked. We've discussed this already, Anton said, sitting and propping his feet onto his desk. Excuses do not a lucrative business make. I've told you once and I'll tell you again, Brandine's biggest mistake was underestimating that girl. Haddock's children, though they've fallen by the wayside a few times, would not abandon their home so easily. I had her, Brandine said through gritted teeth. I had her and she had to go and get pregnant. No, you had to get greedy, Anton said simply. Impatience leads to sloppy mistakes. The plan was flawless. You were willing to live on that island for years to snatch her out of Hiccup's life. A finer apple could not have been better cultivated to pluck. And because the girl had standards, you got impatient and greedy. That was your first mistake. Her pregnancy was only an unfortunate side effect. That unfortunate side effect, Brandine said, his voice hardening, is my son. Yes, yes, Anton sighed, lifting a sheet of paper and scanning the details. Darren, isn't it? Smart lad from what I hear. Brandine went still. What have you heard? You know, it fascinates me, Anton said, running a hand through his blonde goatee. How one such as yourself, who always hated that wretched family and the concept of love and sacrifice for others, is suddenly willing to do anything for a boy you never wanted. I have a lot to gain from him. Indeed, but are you sure it's not love? Even in the darkest recesses of your heart, you want to take him away from the Haddocks and the Larsons and keep him all to yourself. To purge all the goodness from him until he is a shell of his former self, until he is broken and hardened from the woes of life, just like you. Stop it, Brandine bellowed as the other man, likely Chief Grey of Rune, grabbed his arm to keep the boy from launching across the table. Why do you care anyway? I'm only here to make sure you keep up your end of the bargain. Anton dropped his amused facade and dropped his feet to the ground. You know better than that, boy, or at least I thought you did. I too have much to gain from watching Burke burn to the ground. I'll be ready, just as I told you I would be. Don't doubt me. And quite frankly, I don't care. I just like twisting the knife into the heart of weak men who believe themselves to be strong. At the end of the day, you're no different than the Haddocks. I'm nothing like them. You're exactly like them. You merely have a catastrophically different belief system. However, you believe yours to be right just as fiercely as they do theirs. Brandine yanked his arm out of Gray's hold. I'll send you a message when it's time. Don't be late. Anton scoffed as he turned and strode from the room, Ali and Gray on his heels. They were only good for decoration anyway. Death and destruction are my coin, little Anderson. I'll be there when the bell tolls. The slamming door was the only response he got. Still, as Slaver Anton picked up his book and propped his boots back onto his desk, he couldn't help a slow amused smile. Yes, he would be there. Watching mighty men bow in submission was his favorite part. And Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III had had it coming for a long, long time. Adriana's knee bobbed impatiently as she waited, her green eyes fixed on the window. A trio of nadders flew by, causing a fierce updraft that made the windows shudder, yet she hardly noticed. She didn't want to be here. She had to be and needed to be, but she didn't want to be. It took every ounce of her self-control to stay in the chair and wait for Mara. She had questions. No, concerns. Was concerns too strong of a word? Probably. She felt so odd to be here without Eric's knowledge that her stomach cramped up with knots. She'd never come to the healers without telling him about it. Gods, she was a horrible, wretched thing. With her luck he'd see her leave from his leather shop window across the square and become worried. Truly it was nothing, but she'd have to tell him something when he asked. The door swung open and she jumped as Mara swept in, her dark hair pulled high into a bun as always. She smoothed her frock and apron as she shut the door. Sorry, Adriana. I had a few other patients. Oh, that's all right. Adriana waved her off. This isn't urgent, I just have some questions, I guess. Oh. Mara's face had a knowing look to it as she sat in a vacant chair. Tell me about it. Well. I guess I don't exactly know how to put it into words. That's all right. Take your time. So. I guess you could say, Adriana said, fumbling for words. That I'm. At Mara's expectant expression, she huffed. I'm struggling to speak, that's what I am. Mara grinned. I will ask some follow-up questions then, don't fret. Have you been feeling all right? How do you feel? Stressed? Frustrated? Confused? I feel all right. I mean, nothing has changed. Adriana said, averting her eyes. I'm starting to wonder if my issue is more in my head than anything. Have you been, well, for a lack of a better word, expecting anything? At that, Adriana looked up. Mara seemed to be withholding a smile. As if. Oh. No, I mean, I wish yes, but no. Ah. Mara laughed now. Dear, it is all right. I have dealt with this for 20 years. Just say what's on your mind. I'm not pregnant. Oh. Mara said, amusement slipping away. Are you sure? Positive. You say positive, but sometimes it's very difficult to know for sure. Adriana flopped back into her chair. Mara, trust me. I'm not. Well, obviously you wish you were. Ah, bless her for being so intuitive. Basically. I guess I just have been watching the days and marking the calendar and you know, all the things. Mara said, a small yet still sly smirk on her face. Gods blast her for blushing. She'd been a married woman for 3 years now. Adriana cleared her throat. Yeah, but nothing. It's not for lack of trying. I guess I'm just confused because without realizing it I've stopped being affectionate and caught myself thinking if we ever have more kids, so I'm starting to have all these confusing doubts. Mara nodded in understanding. Anna, first of all, there is nothing wrong with any of these thoughts. This is perfectly normal. Without going into details, Does everything seem okay with Eric? During. Yup. All's well. Adriana said quickly, not wishing to go into any details. I would assume so, but sometimes. I know, but legitimately I don't think anything is. Adriana waved her hands around. Not working as they should. And that sounds so weird to say. Gods. A flash of a grin appeared on Mara's face, but it quickly disappeared. Again, that's all right. You know, sometimes these things just take time. It might take years. That's the thing though. Adriana sighed. It's already been years. Darin just turned 3. And sorry, not to be weird, but there have been no shortage of moments. Not weird at all. So, why? Mara pursed her lips. I imagine this would be exceedingly frustrating, especially if you're notating the days. It's a time-consuming effort. It is. It is time-consuming and frustrating when I count the days and then Auntie Flo, as Cliff respectfully calls it, comes to visit once more. Mara rolled her eyes. That nephew of mine. Adriana fought a grin. Supposedly he heard it from Tarin, but I suspect lies. Her smile fell. You see my frustration though. I do. Mara pursed her lips for a long moment, deep in thought. I have a few ideas. I can give you some tonics and teas, things that enhance fertility. Just a few cups a day and we can see if anything happens. And if it doesn't then what can we really do? I prescribe patience. Mara said, leaning forward and patting her knee. I'm not a wife or a mother, so I won't pretend to know what this feels like on a personal level, but I do know that oftentimes it just takes time. Some couples get pregnant without effort it seems, while others have to be patient. Unfortunately it's a normal part of life that many struggle with. But I would suggest trying the teas and tonic, and perhaps don't push Eric away. Have you talked to him about it? Adriana felt that guilt rise up again. No. I would. And if he has any concerns, my door is open to him as well. To talk about patience. No, well yes, but no. Mara said. If he has questions like you or, for lack of a better word, wants a checkup, my door is open. Adriana blinked. Why would he need a checkup? Sometimes things don't work as they should, Mara said. But for all intents and purposes, you're healthy. You've been pregnant before. But Eric's never. Is that common? Adriana asked. For men to have problems? Mara gave her a sad shrug. It's such a difficult thing to know. There's only so much you can deduce, and most people don't wish to speak of their most intimate moments, which is understandable of course. Is it common? Hard to say. Is it impossible? Surely not. Adriana sat back in her chair, mind churning. It felt strange to consider, and yet it would make sense. She'd been pregnant before. There didn't seem to be anything wrong, and yet. Now don't go getting ideas in that pretty head of yours. Mara said firmly. I'm not saying there is anything wrong with Eric, and I hate to even use that word. But Adriana wasn't listening. What if Eric couldn't have kids? It's possible though, Adriana said, interrupting Mara's unheard tangent. Right. Mara pursed her lips. Technically yes, but where are you going? I just remembered, I have to pick up Darin from a play date. Adriana said, thinking fast. I was here longer than I thought I would be. Well, all right. Mara said, standing. She gave Adriana a firm look, but only said, as I said, dear, just be patient and in the meantime I'll prepare some tonics for you. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Adriana said as she pulled the door open and left the room. She gave Inga a small awkward smile as she walked by, but didn't pause to talk. Her mind was churning and she barely registered the purple terrible terror that swept past her as she left the healers. The sun was warm on her face as she walked down the busy street, dodging carts and dragons and passers-by without noticing. It would make sense, she thought. She'd been near religious with counting the days after their moments of intimacy. It certainly wasn't for lack of trying on her part. To be fair, it wasn't for lack of trying on his either, but what if Eric couldn't actually have kids? What if there was something wrong and they didn't know? A sense of devastation pulled at her bones. What a horribly depressing thought, and yet it made sense, after a few years of... "Hi Annie." Adriana flinched away, then put a hand to her chest as Eric appeared at her side. Gods, she'd walked right in front of the leather shop. An amused frown creased Eric's brow. "Are you okay?" "Me?" Adriana asked. "Oh. Yes. I'm fine. Definitely fine." "Are you sure?" "Yes. You just surprised me, that's all." "Right." His teal eyes scanned her face and she waited, holding her breath. "Did you need something?" His brow furrowed. "Well, I don't know. A hello, a hug. Dare I say a midday kiss from my wife as she strolls by on a nice summer day." "Oh. Right." Adriana went up on tiptoes and kissed his cheek. "Sorry, I'm in a rush. I have to go get Darin." His fingers gripped her chin, gentle, always gentle, so that if she wanted to pull away she could. He always gave her a choice. And yet she stilled at the bemused look on his face. "Are you sure you're okay?" Adriana felt her resolve turn to goo. She was acting weird, she knew it. But she couldn't say anything about it here and now, in the middle of the street. She didn't even know what she could say. "Yeah," she said at last, forcing a little joy into her voice. "Yeah, I'm good." This time as she reached up on tiptoes she kissed him, a soft peck that he barely responded to. She dropped back to her heels and tried not to balk at the knowing look in his eyes. She was lying and putting on a face, and he saw right through it. Just as he always had. "Okay," Eric said, a different tone to his voice now. Not anger or even frustration, but something. "I'll see you later then." Feeling instantly horrible, Adriana put a hand to his chest and smoothed the material to his shoulder. "See you later." Her voice came out softer this time. An unspoken apology maybe. That, at least, had been real. Without another word, she turned and walked away. She could feel his eyes on her as she left, feeling more and more guilty with each step she took. And yet she wasn't sure what she felt more guilty for, the lies that something was wrong or her traitorous inner thoughts. Eric had been staring at his ledger for the better part of 20 minutes. He'd hoped crunching numbers for their shop budget would help him to focus when beading and cutting leather and even tanning couldn't seem to shake him out of his funk. But even the precision of mathematics couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding weighing on his shoulders like a blanket. She'd flinched. And not only that, but she'd lied, too. Eric knew his wife better than anyone. Better than he knew himself. He knew her darkest fears and secret dreams and wishes. Her favorite star. Her greatest pleasure and biggest regrets. Her favorite season. Her favorite date. And by extension, she knew everything about him. She alone could read his moods, the expressions that he kept hidden from everyone else. She alone understood his greatest fears and didn't balk. She smoothed away his greatest insecurities with a kind word or gesture. It wasn't perfect, but it was as perfect as it could be. She was branded into his skin, the lifeblood of his every breath. She was his very heart and soul. And she'd flinched away from him and looked at him with fear in her eyes. A distant sound wafted past his ears as he tried to puzzle out that deer in torchlight look on her face when he'd matched her stride from the leather shop door. The flinch was understandable, sometimes you could unintentionally scare people if they were deep in thought. Except that look in her eyes, like a mixture of dismay and fear, as if she'd not meant to walk by the shop at all. Something soft and crunchy knocked into the side of his face and he jolted. He whirled around to see Cliff staring at him with a nonplussed expression. "Welcome back to Burke, Larson. Care to pay attention? I've only been talking to you for 10 minutes. Eric huffed and dropped his ledger. "Sorry." He curled his fingers up and down, realizing they were cramped from the force of gripping the leather book for so long. "I was thinking." "No, you." "Thinking." Cliff snorted and hopped up onto the counter. "What's eating you?" "No, continue your story." "Continue my now you listen here, bucko," Cliff said, pointing a limp cloth at him in what Eric supposed was meant to be a threatening way. "You didn't hear the first half of the story, so why would you presume to think that I'd just start you off in the middle?" Why didn't you stop at the first third of the story if you knew I wasn't listening? I didn't know you weren't listening. It's hard to heckin' tell, bruh. You know when you always get annoyed when I ask if you're listening and you say, yes, of course, Cliffy. I always listen to your stories. And then the few times I don't ask are the times you've conveniently decided to check out. I didn't decide, I'm just a little stressed at the moment. Eric said indignantly. Aha, which is why you are going to spill the beans and tell me what the problem is so we can get back to my story with less brain-rupturing stress. Eric groaned, dropping his head back. Okay, fine. It's... He sighed. It's Adriana. Of course, it is. You're always thinking about her. No, this is different. She's acting weird. Cliff was silent for a minute. I almost came out to say hi earlier but it looked like you two were having a moment. Good or bad? From your point of view. Well. Cliff paused, his jovial tone lessening by the second. He began rubbing some oil onto a strip of leather with the cloth. It's not really my place to say. No, genuinely. Eric said, turning in his chair so they were face to face. You've known us for years. I'm curious what you thought. Cliff pursed his lips. Well, you both looked kinda tense. Eric exhaled a breath. Yeah. It's none of my business, of course, Cliff said, his grey eyes flicking upward for a moment. But is everything okay at home? Sure. I mean it is, but it's not. Cliff snorted. A lame response if I've ever heard one. I don't know how to explain it, Cliff. She's avoiding me, she's hiding things from me, and she just lied to my face when I asked if she was okay. She never acts like this with me. Many other people, but not me. So. Eric exhaled a heavy breath, realizing that he was actually angry. The emotion bubbled beneath his skin. He hated it, but he couldn't figure out what the problem was. What do you mean she's avoiding you? Physically? In every way? Ah, come on, that can't be true. Did you see that kiss she just gave me? Ah no, that would be weird if I was standing at the window watching, don't you think? True. Eric couldn't fight the smile as Cliff snorted. But it wasn't the same as usual and every time I've tried to hold her or anything the last few weeks, she backs away. She actually shoved me away the other day. Now I'm no expert, Cliff said. But maybe she just doesn't feel well. Taryn was like that whenever Auntie Flo would come to visit. Do you have to call it that? In my experience, characterization of some of nature's most despicable and torturous events makes it easier to bear. Yes, because you know what it's like to experience a woman's monthly cycle. No, but you notice the women have clung to the beloved term. It shall go down in history. Focus, Healer Cliff. Right, sorry. Point is, Taryn was always very off limits during her cycle. We have a strict no-touchy rule during those times. Maybe Anna is the same way. And after 3 years of being married, I wouldn't have gotten used to it by now. Eric asked, raising a brow. Cliff shrugged his thin shoulders. Maybe her body is changing. I thought you said you weren't an expert. Maybe she's pregnant. Eric's stomach gave a painful flop. Oh. Cliff said, also going quite still. Gods, I hope not or I just ruined my bestest bra's bestest surprise ever. Eric stared at all the items on his desk without actually seeing them. Could that be why she'd been acting so strange? After all, they hadn't been married for the first trimester of her pregnancy with Darren, so how would he know what her physical mood swings were? What if, oh gods, what if? Oh gods. Nope. Eric pressed his fingers into his eyes and rubbed them. Oh but bruh, what if? No, I'm not entertaining the thought. Just in case it's not that. The disappointment would be soul-crushing. Yeah, that would be the word for it. They'd been trying for a baby for, gods, he wasn't even sure how long. A while. A long while. The thought of that dream coming true with his Annie was, gods, his heart hurt just to think of it. He wanted that more than anything. But, with a long, slow breath, he shoved all those emotions back into their box and shut the lid. Just in case. If by the gods' graces Cliff was right, then that box could explode with joy, but right now it was only conjecture. For all he knew, Adriana was acting weird for another reason entirely. With a long slow breath through his lips, he raised his head. Anyway, I don't know what's going on, but she's just been acting increasingly weird lately. And Cliff leaned forward so the table threatened to topple. And I just saw her leave the healers. Eric frowned as Cliff gave a small gleeful shout. Well, there you go. Don't overthink it, bruh. Seriously, let's just hope and pray that it's something completely normal and happy and good. And if it isn't, then it's Anna, right? She'll tell you what it is. She always does. Yeah. Except he didn't feel the agreement. If it was something good, why did she look so dismayed to see him? He could forgive the flinch, but if it had been just a mere surprise, then she would have brushed it off almost instantly. Smiled at him like she always used to. The kiss wouldn't have been forced. She wouldn't have lied to him. She wouldn't have looked guilty as she walked away. But what was she guilty about? For hiding something from him? For the last few weeks of odd behavior? Or was it something else? What if she was pregnant? They'd decided together that they wanted to grow their little family. But what if it was growing and she'd changed her mind? What if? So anyway, I gotta restart my story at phase 1. You ready? Eric stared unblinking at his ledger. Yup. Okay, buckle your riding gear. As Cliff regaled him with an exhaustive tale of fireworms eating through his mother's rutabaga garden, Eric tried his best to listen. He tried and failed. Perhaps Cliff didn't notice this time or was gracious enough not to point it out, but tiny flying fireballs were the last thing on his mind. That lid on that box shifted and he tamped it down. He wouldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He could be patient. He was always patient with her. Whatever she was going through, they'd work through it, just like they always did. If she gives you a chance, a tiny voice in his mind said. Ignoring that thought, Eric snatched up his ledger and forced his mind away from it. Budget. Cliff's story. Close-up shop. And then he'd go home. Are the western fences rebuilt? Hiccup asked. They finished them an hour ago. Good. Hiccup said, ticking that off his mental checklist. I have first-hand experience with losing kids down that cliff and it's terrifying. I'm glad they made that a priority. Gobber said, groaning as he took a seat at the head table. His blonde hair had long since turned to grey. It was a wonder that he could still get around, elderly as he was. We can't be having any more accidents where that's concerned. The risk of nearly losing Mrs. Ack's cart of hand-knitted clothes was bad enough. Those are meant to go with Johan and Alton on their next visit, you know. Anyway, she works hard on those comfy threads. She does. Hiccup agreed. Hey, Chief. Can I talk to you for a minute? Hiccup turned and found Inga Jorgensen approaching with a harried terrible terror flapping wildly at her side. The terror grabbed at her clothes and she batted at it with a mixed look of irritation and worry. Sure, what's going on? It's Maybelle. Inga gestured up at the terror, who landed on Hiccup's shoulder with an irritated growl. She's Alton's terror. I recognize her, yes. He loaned her from me as one of my best terrors. Hiccup scratched the dragon's chin but she snapped her jaws. What's wrong, girl? That's just it. She arrived a half hour ago, squawking and biting and clawing, Inga said, her blue eyes filling with worry the more she spoke. But there's no letter and I've been waiting for one from Alton for more than a week. I'm sure it's nothing, but... Hiccup frowned and met the dragon's eyes. She seemed to be trying to tell him something with her brown eyes fervently holding his own. What is it? You don't think? Inga halted. Nothing's happened, right? The ship couldn't have. I mean, it's high summer. There are always bad storms. No, that can't be it. Hiccup said. It's possible, but I'm sure it's nothing. Maybe the winds were bad and the letter came off. But you train your terrors to retrieve the letters or parcels when that happens, Chief. Inga insisted, crossing her arms. Besides, losing the letter wouldn't make her freak out like this. Something isn't right. Alton would never send her back with no letter. Hiccup chewed his lip. All right, I'll send someone out there to check on them. They have the trade route, remember, so it won't take long to track them. Or perhaps Maybelle could lead them. Can I go? Inga asked. Hiccup hesitated. With Inga's condition, though she was quite healthy, he wasn't sure she needed this sort of stress, especially while flying. And if something was wrong? That's not my call to make, Hiccup said, knowing full well that Snotlout would never allow her to go. But I'll talk to your dad, okay? Relief filled her expression. Okay. Thanks. Inga. She turned back, looking confused and unsure. I'm sure they're fine, Hiccup said in a firm voice. Alton's a smart kid. He knows what to do in a pinch. Inga smiled in a gentle way that he was sure very few people ever saw. I know. Hiccup watched her go with a smile. The girl was a spitfire, just like her father. And yet her instincts were rarely wrong, like Heather's. Like his own. And though he'd done his best to dissuade some of her fears for her benefit, he agreed with her. Something was off. Alton and Johan always sent regular letters. If something had happened, maybe if they didn't have the time to write one. Nodding to Gobber, Hiccup turned on his heel and began looking for his dragon. He found Toothless outside, sniffing the air with a contemplative look. Come on, bud. We need to find Snotlout and the twins. Toothless sensed something was up and narrowed his eyes as he began searching the village below. Perhaps sending the girl's father out when she was already stressed wasn't the best idea, but Snotlout would see it through. He'd find Alton, and when he returned home to share the good news with his daughter, she'd be ecstatic. Everything would be fine. The twins would have his back. They'd been itching for an adventure anyway. As long as they didn't do anything stupid. No, this was important. They could put their minds to anything, and this was no exception. Adriana couldn't remember the last time she'd been in a dinner so tense. It was strange. Eric came home from work and gave her a smile as always, but that strange look was still in his eyes from earlier in the day. She'd mentally sighed, hoping he'd have forgotten or moved on. Well, that was an ignorant thought if there ever was one. She supposed she'd probably jilted his affections one too many times for it to be considered just a mood or whatever. The evening moved with its usual routine. They tag-teamed playing with Darin and cooking dinner. He fed the dragons in the barn while she gave Darin a bath and read him his favorite book, If You Give a Dragon a Cookie. Only once Darin fell asleep in her arms and she'd put him to bed at a solid 8:30 did she realize the sun was only just sinking and she had nothing else to distract her from the very real and probably very frustrated husband. As it was, Eric didn't appear to be frustrated. Not unless you knew him very well. Which she did. The slight downturn of his mouth and furrowed brow spoke volumes. In truth, she did need to clean a few things in the kitchen, a few dirty pans, some small cups that Darin liked, as well as tossing dirty clothes into a hamper, but she soon realized that Eric wasn't bridging the gap like he usually did. So that meant he was probably waiting for her. Fair enough. She'd shunned him enough that he was probably doing his best to be patient and let her come to him. The thought pained her, only because he didn't deserve to be treated like that or feel like he had to cater to her every emotional whim. He had feelings and emotions, too. And yet, she still had no idea what to say to him. Finally, when she set the last dish out to dry, she glanced toward the living room. He had a book on his lap, his prosthetic stretched out toward the lit fireplace, but she couldn't tell from this distance if he was actually reading or not. Sighing through her nose, Adriana walked into the living room and sat down next to him. She tucked her feet beneath her as she glanced at the book in his hands. Hey. A swift glance in her direction. Hey. Adriana caught a few words on the page and then lifted the cover. An old Doctor Who book. I haven't read those in years. Why did you pull this one out? Eric closed the book and set it on a nearby coffee table. I was just looking at it. And thinking about how, back in those days, we used to tell each other everything. Ouch. All right, she deserved that. I'm sorry. Adriana said softly. She reached out and took his arm in her hands. About earlier. His teal eyes lifted to hers, guarded. He was never guarded with her. Just tell me what's going on. Please. Adriana wasn't sure what to make of that expression. Normally she could read him so well and, she couldn't place this. What do you think is going on? Eric's eyes rolled slightly. Annie, you can't be serious. I'm just trying to figure out what you're thinking, Adriana said. If there's something specific you're expecting me to say. No, I don't want you to try to read my mind and then change your response based on that. Eric said. There was patience in his voice, she could hear it, but it sounded strained. Just tell me, what is wrong? Adriana opened her mouth and then closed it. Eric closed his eyes and looked away, his lips pursed. I'm kind of at a loss right now. You're trying to read my mind, but honestly I don't know what to think. I don't want to hurt your feelings. He faced her with a mixed look of hurt and confusion. It was hurt that she saw on his face at the leather shop. And now. But Adriana added quickly. I think we've already crossed that bridge a little bit. Something like begrudging amusement filled his expression and he looked away. Yeah, you could say that. I don't want to make it worse. Eric pursed his lips for a long moment and then took a deep breath before twisting on the couch to face her more fully. Just tell me. Whatever it is, I'm a big boy. I can handle it. Eric. No, Annie. Whatever it is, I need to hear it. Clearly I do, or you wouldn't be balking from it. Balking from me for weeks. No, that's not, I didn't. Adriana buried her face in her hand. That wasn't intentional. I only noticed a pattern the other day. The other day when you pushed me away. Fair, though. Eric said, raising his hands sheepishly. Sometimes you're not in the mood and you have to beat me away. It's fine. He was trying so hard to be light-hearted. She appreciated it, but it wasn't going to make this any easier. Yeah. Adriana took his hand in hers and traced a thumb across one of the scars across his knuckles from training. The pads of his fingers were calloused from firing his bow so regularly. I went to see Mara today. He was silent for a long moment. I know. Adriana pursed her lips. You saw me leave her place. Yes. You were really jumpy when you left. Truth by truth. She could do this. She kept her eyes on their hands, even as his fingers began stroking up and down her palm. I was. Not at you, but some things I talked about with Mara. Another long pause. Such as. Did she hear a slight quiver in his voice? No, maybe she'd imagined it. She stubbornly kept her eyes on their hands. If she met his eyes as she said it, she wasn't sure if she'd have the guts to say what was on her mind. She let out a quick breath. I went to talk to her about getting pregnant since we've been trying for a long time and it hasn't happened yet. Something flickered in his eyes as they went to their locked hands, but his voice was soft as he said, "Oh." And what did she say? Well, nothing much, really. It's not as though I don't know how it works so much as wondering why it's taking so long. Adriana glanced up at him through her hair. You know, I was keeping track of the days. Every time I'd count the days until I was most fertile. You can do that? Adriana fought a sudden laugh. Yes. Eric shook his head with a wry grin. I knew you were counting days on your calendar, but I didn't know why. Why did you stop? Because it's time-consuming and disappointing, every time I'd find out we weren't. He was quiet for a long moment. Annie. She could see the sympathetic look on his face, but she kept her face turned down. Somehow she found bravery in her cowardice, but she managed to say, and I think after a while I stopped hoping. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I just stopped. They were silent for a long minute until Eric leaned forward and lifted her chin. His teal eyes were bright. You're not alone in this. Don't think for 1 minute that I haven't hoped for that, too. Maybe it'll just take more time for us. He wiped a tear off her cheek with a thumb. What did Mara say? She said she'll give me some tea and tonics, but I'm not confident that will help. It wouldn't hurt to try, right? Hey. Eric ducked his head so he could meet her eyes. Annie, we're still young. 21 and 22. We're not. What if? Adriana interrupted, causing her heart to lodge into her throat. What if we can't? What do you mean? Why wouldn't we? I mean, you're right, sometimes it is harder for some couples and it takes a lot of time, but it is possible for some people to be barren. But you're not, are you? No, Mara says I'm healthy, so there shouldn't be any problem. I'm obviously not pregnant though, so there has to be an issue. Adriana hedged. What if there isn't an issue though? Eric asked softly. I can be patient. There's no rush. What if there is an issue though? Adriana asked. I mean, I can obviously have kids. Wait. Eric's brows furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Adriana took a deep breath. I'm just saying we have proof that I can get pregnant. But what if I'm not getting pregnant now because you can't have kids? There it was. It came out much more flawlessly than she'd expected, and yet, there it was. The house was eerily silent for the longest minute while she watched him process her words. You don't think I can have kids? Eric asked slowly. Adriana pursed her lips and nodded. It's the most logical explanation. Eric frowned. Logical isn't the word I would use. Oh. Adriana said, crossing her arms. And what would you call it? Making assumptions. Eric said indignantly. What if we just haven't gotten pregnant yet because we just haven't gotten pregnant yet? Why are you assuming there is something wrong with me? Adriana sighed. Because it's easier than having false hope. Eric's mouth dropped open. What? You would rather accept the notion that I just can't have kids instead of being patient? Okay, then. Sorry, I don't have an endless supply of patience like you do. Oh, trust me, it's running dry. Eric muttered. What's that supposed to mean? Seriously? So after weeks of ignoring me and pushing me away, I come to find out it's all because you've given up on growing our family, on me. Something in his tone grew sharper at that. And I'm still supposed to have endless patience when you're being both unkind and unfair. Fair. Adriana sat up. What does fair have to do with anything? I never asked for any of this to happen. If I'd had it my way I would have gladly gotten pregnant after Darren's first birthday, but I didn't. Yeah, and apparently that's my fault. Apparently. It only took once with Adriana broke off, appalled at herself for almost saying the name of the person she hated more than anything, who'd done the most horrible thing imaginable to her. But it didn't matter as Eric flinched anyway. Instantly she felt cold with dread. Oh gods. Eric. His anger had disappeared instantly, replaced with a mixed look of disbelief and horror. What? Adriana shook her head and reached for his hand. Nothing, Eric pulled his arm away. How could you even say that? I didn't mean it. I was just angry. And that's supposed to make me feel better. Eric said, abruptly rising to his feet. No, of course not. Adriana said, jumping up and grabbing his arm. I just meant that because I have had a child, then obviously. I'm well aware that you've conceived a child before, Adriana. Eric said firmly, dropping his hands from where he'd shoved them into his hair. I kinda adopted him. Adriana felt a rush of anger, though she tried to stamp it out. Yes, but he's not your biological son, is he? It's not the same. Eric raised his hands, looking more shocked and frustrated by the second. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Since when? We have never made that distinction with Darren. No, and I don't want to. For all intents and purposes, you are Darren's father. Adriana replied. But maybe we should start being realistic and stop wishing for things that might not ever happen. We have a son. We should be grateful and just move on. Stop shoving your decisions onto me. You're the one choosing to give up, not me. Well, you can't try without me, so good luck. Why are you acting like this? Eric demanded. What did I do to you that you are being so spiteful about this? Are you that upset that I haven't gotten you pregnant or what? I don't know, maybe I'm sick of being disappointed. Eric went still at that, the expression on his face turning morose. They were standing almost nose to nose as he looked down at her. His teal eyes flicked across her face as the hurt in them built and built, his breath trembling. Adriana glanced at his mouth as his jaw clenched and he swallowed hard. She could reach up on her tiptoes to kiss him if she wanted. For some reason, a tiny voice in her head told her to do so. It would be the start of an apology. But it wouldn't be enough to heal the wound she'd dealt him. Fine. Eric whispered. I'll just get out of your way then. Only the sound of the step thunk of his mismatched steps interrupted the silence. Adriana watched as he grabbed a jacket and slipped outside, the door swinging quietly shut behind him. Reeling, Adriana slid into the closest chair. That had not gone well at all. She'd suspected as much, but she'd said so many horrible things. She'd spoken the truth, maybe not conscious thoughts she'd been holding on to, and regardless of how horrible each one sounded, she wasn't lying. If Eric couldn't have kids, then why should they wish for more than what they had already? They already had a near-perfect life, so why wish for disappointment and pain? Except, that tiny voice said, you've already brought disappointment and pain into it. Each venomous word she'd said played back in her mind and her stomach gave a painful lurch. It only took once with. I'm sick of being disappointed. The reality of the things she'd said to him washed over her. Oh gods. Eric was right. She was being both unkind and unfair. And after everything he'd ever done for her, regardless of those things, all he'd ever wanted was to have a family with her. She'd once promised him she'd never look at him with disdain. And she'd just stabbed him in the back anyway, promises forgotten. Leaping to her feet, Adriana ran outside and spun in a circle in the empty street, looking to see where he'd gone. But he was nowhere in sight. A quick look in the barn showed Lily and Charger both still sleeping in their pens. Hot tears slipped down her face. Oh gods, what did I do? She couldn't go after him. It would probably take hours to find him and Darren was inside sleeping. She couldn't leave him alone. And yet it was excruciatingly painful to stay, to know that Eric was out here somewhere feeling betrayed and upset and knowing that she was the cause of it. I'm sorry. Adriana said, covering her face. I'm sorry. But Eric wasn't there to hear it, and if he had been, he probably wouldn't have wanted to anyway. XXX. Eric struck the dummy until hay burst into the air. Jab, duck slice, the fighting movements he'd learned and perfected the last few years turned to muscle memory. And yet it did nothing to temper the emotions coursing through him. Anger. Pain. Betrayal. Grief. Despair. The lid on the box had exploded at last, though for a completely different reason. How could she do this to him? It wasn't enough that she'd ignored him these weeks and then lied to his face. It was uncanny how the one thing he'd forced himself not to think about that very afternoon was the exact thing that was bothering Adriana. But he'd never, ever thought that she'd say those words to him. All it took was once with. Maybe I'm just sick of being disappointed. And with those statements came surging from the back of his mind every worthless thought he'd ever believed about himself. He knew they weren't true, but that didn't stop the thoughts from peppering his mind now as he trashed dummy after dummy in the arena. It was all too good to be true anyway. She's too good for you. She could do so much better. She's better off without you. You aren't good enough. Lies. 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 With a frustrated growl, Eric whipped around to throw one of his knives across the arena at another dummy, and barely managed to not throw it straight into fearless Finn's chest. Whoa. Finn arms went out. Gods, didn't you hear me calling you? No. He hadn't heard anything above the roaring in his head. Panting heavily, Eric lowered his arm. Go away. Finn's brows shot up as he stalked away. Hello to you, too. I take it someone's in the doghouse. Gods, Finn, I don't want to talk to you or anyone, so just leave me alone. Eric didn't wait for a response as he began gathering up stray arrows he'd misheard across the arena. Other than his shaking breath and footsteps, he heard nothing, assuming Finn had left. A quick glance out of the corner of his eye showed Finn still standing there, watching him in silence. Chest burning with quiet rage, Eric ignored him and stepped over a dismembered dummy. "Eric, what's wrong?" "What part?" Eric said, whipping around, "of I don't want to talk to you or anyone, didn't you understand?" Finn raised his hands in a placating way. "Fine. We don't have to talk. But I'm not leaving you here to hack yourself to pieces alone, all right?" Without another word he began pulling arrows out of a few nearby dummies and dropped them into a nearby pile. Though Eric really preferred to be alone, he knew there was wisdom in this, so he said nothing. Plus he'd have more luck draining the ocean than forcing Finn to do otherwise, once his mind was made up. With his luck he probably would have lost a finger or two, what with his throwing weapons around the arena in his fit of rage. But maybe the pain would have been an outlet, so who really cared? It wouldn't be the first time he'd taken a blade to his flesh. Eric ground to a halt with a choked sort of sound. Gods! Finn went still nearby. What? He forced himself to take a deep breath and let it out before dropping his weapons. Disgusted at his inner thoughts, he shook his head. It was interesting, the way his rage disappeared in mere seconds and was replaced with loathing and hatred for not Adriana's words, but himself. Even though things had changed so much these last few years, he was still weak. "Hey, I don't like it when you go all still and quiet. Talk to me." Eric shook his head. What was the point? Of what? Everything. Marrying her, adopting her son, all of it. Finn went very, very quiet. "What are you talking about? What happened?" "It doesn't matter. Stop it." Finn was suddenly there and shaking him by the shoulders. He hardly felt it. "What do you mean, what was the point? You love her and you love Darin, so why are you doubting that? I need more information if I'm going to properly help. Why bother? According to her I'm just a disappointment anyway." Despite the darkness, Finn's face was clearly pinched with worry. "Look, bruh, I'm not, my parents, or Anna, or even Cliff. I'm not good at this sort of thing. So you're going to have to give me more context." A tiny voice in his head said to keep pushing Finn away, keep being negative. Maybe he'd get fed up and leave, and then he'd. With a flash of anger, Eric yanked his weapons belt off his waist. "Take it." "What?" "Take every weapon you can see and get them away from me." Finn stared for a long moment but then he nodded once before obeying. Eric hated himself for having these thoughts, these old temptations to take his pain out on himself, but maybe it wasn't weakness somehow, to ask for help even in this way. Finn seemed to understand it as much. He surely wouldn't leave Eric to his own devices after this. Not now. And being alone was obviously the last thing Eric needed. Clearly he couldn't trust himself. Even as Finn cleared the arena of anything sharp that he could find, including his own weapons, Eric hated that Adriana's words had rocked him so badly. He hadn't wanted to hurt himself in years and yet it was somehow like nothing had changed. After a while, Finn approached on near silent feet. "That bad? I haven't wanted to hurt myself in years," Eric whispered. He ignored the temptation to look down at his arms, at the white lines that were forever reminders of the pain he'd been through. That he'd put himself through. "Why do you want to now?" Finn was the last person he wanted to talk to about this. "Come on, I can see you trying to shove it aside." "She blames me, all right," Eric said at last, a spark of temper dominating that self-loathing at last. It was quickly diffused. "She blames me. For what?" Eric swallowed. "Kids. We've been trying to have more kids for years and, nothing." "Ah," Finn said in as neutral a tone as he could muster. "And why would she blame that on you? Does it matter? Point is she's given up and I'm a disappointment, and best of all, it only took her once to get pregnant before, so." "Wait, what?" Finn interrupted. "She didn't actually say that, did she?" "Yup." The arena was quiet for a long, long minute as Finn chewed on everything he'd heard. "Well, that's completely unfair. I mean, unmarried as I am, I'm no expert, but it takes two to tango. Who says it's your fault? And can't it take a long time anyway?" That's what I said, and she'd rather set the blame on me and make assumptions that I can't have kids than be patient. Finn huffed. Eric, don't listen to that. What if she's right though? She's not. Well, Finn paused. I mean, I don't know obviously, but you know how Adriana gets. She gets upset about something and she tries to come up with an explanation, and once she finds one, she doesn't let it go. And then she lashes out. I'm not saying it's right, but that's how it's always been. Yeah, except she called me a disappointment. At least Brandine gave her what she really wanted. Eric hated the words, but that's essentially what she'd said. Gods, it hurt to breathe, to think. She once said she'd never look at me with disdain. Now she can hardly look at me at all. Finn was quiet for a long, long moment. She hates him more than anything. She would never think you're worth less than him, kids or no. Eric hated the way his eyes burned, but he turned them to Finn anyway. And if it was you and Jen, it would be so easy. No. Of course not. But I know my sister. She loves you and that little kid, more than anything. For lack of a better word, you were her dream. Don't give up on her because she screwed up. Finn added to himself, mind you, big screw up, one that will soon be rectified, I assure you. But I know you too. You beat yourself up to this day as if you're not good enough, and it's not true. What if she's right? You have the opportunity to raise Darren regardless, because last I checked, you are his dad. Eric tried not to, but his eyes burned further. Bruh, stop that. Finn suddenly pulled him into an awkward half sort of bear hug. He then patted Eric's head and gave a half-hearted, there. Eric burst into chuckles, tears and all. Gods, you really suck at this. I really do. Shoving Finn back a step, Eric dragged his shirt up over his face and scrubbed it roughly. No, but seriously, thanks. Finn nodded. Everyone gets one free cry and comfort session with Finn for life. So far only you, Anna and Cliffy have cashed in on the deal. The parents birthed me so they get a lifelong supply, as does my future bride. I'm surprised you held out this long. My sister made me cry with frustration on more than one occasion. Do the witticisms never end? It's a trademark of Fearless Finn Enterprises. What can I say? At least I'm consistent. Eric sighed and rubbed his face. He needed to go home, and yet. As if reading his thoughts, Finn said, why don't you crash at my house tonight? Isn't that bad form? Not in my book. Finn said. I mean, it might be, but maybe it'll shake her down to her boots a bit. Isn't that cruel? Eric asked. I haven't stayed away from her for a night since we got married. Excluding trips. It's up to you, but I know you. Finn said with a shrug. Either put on a brave face and try to cope all night, or take a night to yourself. My door's open. Do you want to leave your weapons here? Eric pondered this. Though his heart still hurt, he already felt a little better after talking things out with Finn. He could fight the temptation. No, I'll take them with me. It will be a pain to retrieve them tomorrow. Besides, someone will probably steal my good Jatan steel. Finn smirked and nodded. It's only the finest. Eric trudged out of the arena with Finn and made quick work of his weapons belt and quiver. Sighing, he met Finn at the metal gates. I think I will crash at your place tonight. I'll probably feel guilty for it later, but... Hey, Taryn kicked Cliff out a few months ago because she'd had enough of his, what was it? Constant jabbering worse than a terror on Sunday. Something like that. At any rate, having a Cliff Smedley knocking on your door at 2 in the morning saying I have nowhere else to go is quite annoying, so I'd rather just set you up before I go to bed. Fair enough. Finn glanced over at Eric and threw an arm over his shoulder. Everything will be fine, bruh. Eric nodded, but didn't feel the sentiment. He'd never been betrayed by Adriana so thoroughly before. Her words still echoed through his mind and into his heart, cutting deep, just as his knives once did on his wrists. No, ignore that. Finn was right, everything would be fine. Maybe. Hopefully. Tomorrow was a new day. Maybe she would sleep her frustration off and so would he. Maybe tomorrow morning they would fix things. Somehow he doubted it. After all, she'd been ignoring him for weeks, possibly months. How long had she been having these thoughts? How long had she been dissatisfied with him? How long had he been a disappointment to her? A headache pulsed behind his eyes and he sighed through his nose, matching Finn's long strides as his house soon came into view. A chirp of greeting split the night as Zap scrambled out of her pen to greet them. Eric hardly felt the brush of her warm, fishy breath on his face. He just wanted to close his eyes and forget. But in the silence of darkness many hours later, he could still hear her voice, still see the anger in her green eyes, still hear that tempting voice, sharp and cold as steel. When the sun split the horizon at dawn, his blade met skin. Chapter 3, Veritas. Chapter text. Adriana's flight to the Great Hall was a bodiless, mindless experience. She felt a bit detached, like a ship lost at sea with a broken rudder. Lily growled at her a few times, but her questions went unheard. Eric hadn't come home last night. No matter the fights, the arguments, the tears and frustrations, they'd always still slept together. That had been their agreement, that no matter the argument, they wouldn't go to bed separated, brimming with anger and frustration. Somehow it bridged that gap better than any time and space. And yet she'd found his side of the bed cold and empty this morning, devoid of his warmth and scent and comfort. Not that she deserved his comfort. Quite the opposite. She'd spent most of the night weeping for the horrid things she'd said to him. As Lily landed, she slipped out of the saddle and gave her dragon a pat on the nose before slipping inside. Voices echoed through the massive chamber already, but she didn't look around at the crowd, hoping to keep a low profile. Instead she found herself aiming for the drink bar where she found her brother pouring steaming water into a large mug. "Hi," Adriana said with a wan smile. "You never drink tea. Is Jen here?" Finn's blue eyes flicked to hers, cold. "No. She's not." Shocked at his tone, Adriana frowned. Then, without another word, Finn grabbed the mug and stalked to the massive round table set up in the middle of the great hall. The crowd parted for him as he walked and Adriana's heart leaped as he set the mug in front of a solitary individual sitting in one of the chairs. "Eric." Adriana was moving before she'd realized it, but she halted as her brother firmly said, "Drink it." Eric didn't even blink. His fingers were locked over the lower half of his face, teal eyes distant. Finn straightened as she approached, his blue eyes hard. Accusatory. He stepped closer and said in a low voice, "If you don't have anything nice to say to him, then don't speak." Adriana scowled, offended at his tone and aggression. "I don't. I'm serious." Finn hissed. "Be kind, or don't speak." He turned away without another word, snatching a few papers out of Gobber's hand to review before the meeting. Adriana scowled after him but forced herself to take a slow breath. He was right, though he didn't need to be so nasty about it. But he wouldn't be acting like that if he wasn't worried. And looking at her husband. Eric's face was pale, his teal eyes rimmed with dark circles as if he hadn't slept. He wore a long-sleeved blue shirt, despite the heat of summer. He lacked any sort of weapons belt, which was strange. He almost never left the house without his weapons nowadays. For a lack of a better word, he looked terrible, and it was all her fault. She carefully took the seat next to him and swallowed. "Hi." Eric blinked and glanced casually in her direction but it was no more than a shift of his eyes. As if he couldn't stand to look at her. He said nothing. "I'm sorry," Adriana whispered, reaching out to take his arm. Her fingers brushed his arm and he jerked away. "Don't," Eric whispered in a hoarse voice. Adriana bit her lip and stared at the mug in front of him, steam curling in the air between them. The tea bag bobbed at the surface as it steeped. He hadn't touched it, but she wondered if it was due to disinterest or because he always took 3 swills of honey in his tea. Finn didn't know this, but she did. Without another word, she strode to the drink table and snatched up the jar of honey. Returning to her seat, she added the honey to the mug and stirred it with a spoon. It was nothing, a small gesture that paled in comparison to the horrible things she'd said to him, but at the end of the day, she still loved him. She'd done this to them, driven them apart. Even if he didn't want to talk, which she deserved, she would still be kind and patient. Gods knew he'd always been patient with her. As she slid the mug closer to him, Eric closed his eyes and slid his fingers upward to cover them. As if her kindness pained him and he couldn't bear to see it. She almost said, "It's not a bribe, I'm just trying to be nice," but held her tongue. Clearly he'd been with Finn all night, and if he'd said to keep her mouth shut, well, maybe she should heed his instruction for once. So she sat back in her seat and looked around at the men and women gathered at the table for their weekly meeting. Finn was deep in discussion with Manny the Mad and Gobber across the table while her parents, Hiccup and Astrid, were poring over a map with multicolored lines and notes. Fishlegs was murmuring in Hiccup's ear and he nodded, but strangely he wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at them. Hiccup's green eyes flicked to Eric and back at her. "What's wrong?" Adriana pursed her lips and shook her head slightly. "Nothing." Those green eyes narrowed. "Nice try, Addy." A shrug. "I do my best." A small smile and he refocused on the map to make a few notes. Adriana sighed. That was the problem with being so close to family, physically and personally. It didn't take long for everyone to figure out there was something wrong. The gong rang out and everyone began to take their seats. "All right, let's get started," Hiccup said, dropping his charcoal onto the map. "We have a few announcements but this shouldn't take too long." Eric sighed through his nose and seemed to force himself to pay attention, dragging his hands down his face and lowering them at last. "First off, everything is as normal as can be. We haven't had anything strange happen near our borders and both Brawn and Berserker claim the same. We'll continue our patrols as normal." A collective sigh and Hiccup paused. "Chief, wouldn't it be prudent?" Mulch said from a few seats down. "Well, that is to say, wouldn't it be safe to assume that nothing is happening after 2 years of scouting the ocean and Burke is safe?" Hiccup shook his head. "We've been over this. There's too much at stake, and we can't assume that nothing is happening out there. It may not have reached us yet." Emphasis on the last word because of my next 2 statements. Eric sharpened at that, just as Adriana felt her attention divert from him to her father. "I received a message from Ali of Outcast Island," Hiccup said, setting a letter atop his notebook. "She states that someone has been going out of their way to tamper with the slave trade. Slavers and owners alike are calling him the Night Rider. Apparently this individual has been attacking ships and stealing slaves, and she's accusing me of meddling in her affairs. She would assume it was you," said Fishlegs. "If they are having a hard time capturing this individual, then they would assume it was you and Toothless." Toothless growled indignantly from behind Hiccup and Astrid's chairs. "I didn't say it was you, Toothless," Fishlegs cried, holding up his hands. "I'm just saying logically." "No, you're right, Fishlegs. That's exactly what she's assuming. I've already sent her a response stating that I've made my position clear. I don't want any part in the slave trade, so it would be hypocritical of me to get involved." Finn's mouth tightened at that but he said nothing. "But who is this mysterious Night Rider?" Manny the Mad demanded, his arms leaned atop his tall double-bladed axe. "Could it be one of their own? What if they are kidnapping their own slaves and disposing of them, and trying to pin it on us? It would give them an excuse to have open war like they've always wanted." "What if they don't want war though?" Mulch said. "I mean, they've got what they want already. They've got their extra hands and their lands are showing more harvest after the last 2 seasons. That's beside the point," Finn interrupted at last. "We don't have enough information to make assumptions. They wanted to make us afraid at the convocation, so it would be stupid to ignore that." "Indeed, which brings me back to my original point," Manny growled. "That this Night Rider is ruffling feathers." "Exactly," Hiccup said. "So if anyone hears anything about this, please let me know. I don't like the idea of our enemies looking at us too closely when we haven't done anything." Adriana pondered this information. Without thinking or remembering that they weren't on speaking terms, she whispered to Eric, "What does the Night Rider hope to accomplish by stealing away slaves anyway?" Eric shrugged. "They must be making a difference in numbers if Ali's sniffing around." "True." She tried to meet his eye, but he stubbornly kept his eyes forward. "The last thing I wanted to bring to your attention," Hiccup said, folding his hands and meeting some of their eyes. This may not be cause for worry, so I want everyone to keep their heads. Inga Jorgensen received Alton and Johan's terror yesterday, but she had no message. She was highly distressed. Inga thought it was odd, so she brought her to me and I agreed. I sent Snotlout, Rough Nut, and Tough Nut out to investigate last night. Adriana glanced around and saw the three were indeed missing. No wonder the meeting was going so quickly, the three perpetrators keen on interrupting weren't here. We haven't heard back from them yet, but we'll have a meeting once they return with a report. I don't want any rumors circulating about their whereabouts if Johan and Alton are completely fine. They are fine though? Adriana asked, drawing everyone's attention. Aren't they? Hiccup pursed his lips. I hope so. Why wouldn't they be? Manny the Mad said. They're a pair of traders. Maybe they got robbed and the terror got spooked. Terrors don't get spooked easily. Finn said, frowning at the table. Have you said anything to Clyde and Joan? No. Astrid said firmly. And we don't want to, not until we know more information. Depending on how far they have to go, it may be a few days or even a week before they return with an update. Hiccup said. In the meantime, it's business as usual. We'll continue our scouting missions. If anyone sees or hears anything, keep me updated. Adriana's mind was burning with questions as her father concluded the meeting. The scrape of chairs and voices filled the chamber, but she kept her eyes focused on the table. Why would the terror leave Alton and Johan in such a panic? Why would she go to Inga? Well, that was no mystery, of course she would go to Inga. They kept a steady stream of conversation via letters and parcels, as far as she knew. Still, Johan and Alton were vital to keeping them informed on general movements between the islands and beyond. What if they'd discovered something? What if they were in danger? I don't like it. Adriana said at last. Eric was silent for a long moment. Me neither. His fingers were tight against his arm where they were crossed over his chest. Forgetting the mystery of Alton and Johan's whereabouts, she stared at the gold ring on his finger, and suddenly longed to take his hand. Eric. Hey, you too. Hiccup's voice cut in before she could say more. How are you? Without a word, Eric stood and walked away. Adriana spun in her chair and tried to think of something to say, to push her parents away, who were both watching in mute surprise, to call him back, to say something. But clearly he didn't wish to talk to anyone and she wasn't sure what to say anyway. What was that about? Astrid asked, blue eyes crinkled with concern. Nothing. Adriana said, rising from her chair at last. She frowned sadly at the full mug of tea. It really said something about how upset he was, that Finn had gone out of his way to make him a mug, and that he hadn't touched it. It's nothing. Addie. No, it's... Adriana huffed, fighting the burn of frustrated tears. It's nothing. I need to pick up Darin. I'll see you both later. She strode away, ignoring their concerned looks. She couldn't stand it. She'd caused this whole mess herself. Mara had even told her not to go getting ideas and making things worse, and she'd done it anyway. She deserved Eric's anger and frustration and silence. She deserved to spend her days alone because of what she'd said. There had been a time that she'd told herself that Eric deserved so much better and he'd always convinced her otherwise. He'd said that he chose to love her, no matter what she'd ever done or what had been done to her. But she was a vile creature that could be so cruel and wicked sometimes. He'd always had endless patience and kindness. He'd always come back to her. Always. But she'd never betrayed him like this before. They'd had their spats and arguments, but he'd always come back to her, and she to him. What if she'd broken them beyond repair this time? What if he never came back? What if she'd ruined everything? As it turned out, her husband was not ignorant to the few locations she would have dropped Darin off while they were in the meeting. Having 3 grandmothers in his life, and one of them being Chiefess of Burke, obviously Darin would be located at either Loffin's or Lara's house. In this case, to avoid any potential awkward conversations with Eric's mother, Adriana had chosen Loffin. She was clever, but he was clever, too. Even in his hurt, exhausted state. When Adriana had arrived, her tears drying in the skies as she flew with Lily. She was informed that Eric had already picked Darin up. Lofton's kind blue eyes were solemn as Adriana thanked her and left, not wishing to take up any more of the woman's time, or shed any more tears. And yet it was not meant to be. No matter how hard she had ever run from her emotions or the consequences of her actions, they'd always come chasing her down, usually in the form of one parent or another. She'd just arrived home and told Lily to take a long flight when a voice called, "Adri." Adriana briefly considered running inside and locking the door, but knew her mother would not be deterred. Sighing, she released the door handle and turned. "Hi, Mom." Astrid hopped off of Stormfly and patted her flank, smiling as her beloved dragon ran off with a squawk. "I wanted to see if you were okay. Without your father here, that is. I know he can be a little overbearing sometimes." "He wasn't though," Adriana said. "That was just typical me, running from my problems. You and Eric both, it seems." "Did you see him?" "Yes, he was taking Darin to the beach." "Your father went with them, I think." Adriana nodded. "Good. He shouldn't be alone." Astrid's blue eyes sharpened. "Why do you say that?" Confused by her reaction, Adriana wasn't sure what to say. "We had a fight yesterday, that's all." "I mean, that isn't all, like it wasn't significant." "But why do you ask?" Her mother pursed her lips. "Let's go inside." Sighing through her nose, Adriana nodded. She led the way inside and instantly cringed at the mess scattered throughout the house. "Oh gods, sorry about the mess." "Don't apologize," Astrid said, taking a chair and sitting in it without preamble. "I had 2 kids at one time, I get it. Houses will be lived in. There's no shame in that." Adriana nodded and took her usual chair. "Thanks." Astrid tapped the table with a few fingers. "We talked to Finn after you both left." "Oh. Eric spent the night at his house last night." "Yeah," Adriana sighed. "I didn't know where he'd gone, but I figured as much after Finn's comments this morning." "What did he tell you?" "To be nice." Astrid frowned. "Did he tell you anything else?" "No." "Why should he have?" Her mother was silent for a long, long minute. "Eric cut himself last night. On purpose." A prickling sensation flooded from the roots of her hair down to her toes. "What?" "No." "Yes, he did," Astrid said. "Finn found him trying to stop the bleeding early this morning, and I only found all of this out because he nearly bit my head off after you and Eric left. So I knew something was wrong." Adriana clapped her hands over face, tears blotting out her vision. "Oh gods, what did I do?" Astrid's arms wrapped around her as she wept. She'd done some horrible things. Said some horrible things over the years. She'd been cruel to people before, especially her parents. She'd felt guilt for those things and eventually mended those relationships and had been forgiven. But this, she'd never felt more guilty about anything in her life. "Adriana, breathe," Astrid whispered. "Don't fall to pieces. He's all right." "He's not all right," Adriana said, pulling out of her arms. She wiped her face on her shirt and took a few heaving breaths. I broke him, This is my fault. Tell me what happened." Adriana's eyes continued to fill and stream as she told Astrid everything. She'd only ever had one other conversation with her mother that was as excruciating, but that had been a different context and story entirely. Astrid's eyes grew bright as she admitted everything she'd been thinking, about not getting pregnant, about wondering if Eric couldn't have kids, even all the promises they'd made to each other years ago. It was painful to admit everything out loud, especially his reaction to the filthy things she'd said, and hated to make some excuse as if she didn't mean it, because the words had come from her heart. The words hadn't come from nothing. And she despised herself for them. I mean I haven't ever compared him to." Adriana swallowed, her voice thick. "To Brandine. Not once. Not ever. But that's what I did." Astrid nodded slowly and took her hand. "You made him feel inadequate. How can something so wonderful be the thing that drives us apart after all this time?" Adriana said bitterly. "If I'd just gotten pregnant by now." That isn't the answer. Astrid said firmly. You're not the only one to have these sorts of problems, and Mara said the same thing, right? The problem is you just got an idea in your head and you wouldn't let it go. If Eric even said that you're both still young and he's not in any rush, then that's all that matters right now. Adriana sniffed. And I couldn't just let it go. No. But for the record, he isn't broken. He's hurting. Badly. Unfortunately it went so deep that it caused him to relapse, but Finn has all his weapons. He regretted it the second he gave in. Astrid sighed. I don't know what that sort of depression feels like, but it can't be easy to silence that voice. Nor do I think it's easy to be patient and not look for someone or something to blame for not being able to grow your family. It's not bad to want more kids, Adri. But it is bad to push him away. Chances are it's not his fault. Adriana nodded. Will he ever speak to me again? Of course he will. He just needs time and patience. Astrid tilted up her chin with a finger. Don't give up on him. He's never given up on you. Nodding again, Adriana grabbed her mom in a tight hug. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me. You didn't hurt me. No, but you're probably disappointed. Never, baby girl. Astrid patted her head. Never. Hiccup hoped and prayed that he'd never again see this look on Eric's face, just as he hoped he'd never again see bandages wrapped around his forearms. One part of him thought, at least it was only a single cut. The other part of him balked, knowing just how deep that single cut had been. As Finn had recounted the events with him and Astrid, Hiccup had felt a sharp pain in his heart with every word. Suddenly he was back in the woods with Eric, ready to open his own veins to prove to the boy that it wouldn't fix anything, that hurting himself wouldn't stop the internal pain. That his life was precious. Eric looked like a ghost now. His teal eyes followed Darin as he ran up and down the sand with Charger, the massive green Nada squawking and flinging sand in all directions as the boy cackled. A hint of a smile pulled at Eric's face as the dragon picked Darin up by the shirt and began carrying him down the beach, screaming as he hung on for dear life. Dawa Addy! Save me! Toothless growled at Charger, who cocked his head and then gently deposited the boy into the saddle. Darin squealed with delight and tried to reach the stirrups, but failed miserably. Watch him take that thing apart so you'll never fly again. Eric murmured. Hiccup snorted softly. He's a smart kid. The smile faded from Eric's face seconds after it appeared. I cut myself this morning. The flatness of his tone cut at Hiccup's heart. I know. Finn told you. You scared him. He knew we helped you last time. I don't blame him. Eric closed his eyes. I tried to fight it. All night. But every time I'd tell myself to stop thinking about it, her words would come back to me and... Hiccup swallowed. Finn told me about that, too. Even if it's coming from Addy, you can't let that kind of negativity rule your actions. That's just where it started. Eric choked out. She had to go and compare me to. He cut himself off and looked away, frustration etched into every inch of his body. At least he can get the job done, apparently. Stop, don't say that. Hiccup said firmly. I know Addy says things out of anger at times and there's no excuse for it, but that's not how she really feels. You know she'd never prefer him over you, no matter what. Eric said nothing. He really didn't want to ask, but for the record, is everything fine? Gods, I knew you were going to ask. Yes, I'm in perfect working order, thank you. Hiccup decided not to reply to that. He deserved the bite. He certainly wouldn't have wanted anyone asking him that question either, and yet he felt it was a little justified. And then she had to start making comments about how Darin isn't technically mine, so I should just be grateful that he's all I'm ever going to have. Hiccup took a deep breath through his nose and exhaled. I'm sorry. She shouldn't have said any of those things. I know they're not true. Eric said. All the lies I keep telling myself. That I'm not good enough, that she deserves better. But I don't know how to make them stop either. Just keep reminding yourself of what's true. Hiccup said, looking over at his son-in-law. You are the best thing that's ever happened to her. You are the best father that boy is going to have, and the only father he's ever going to have. He watched as Eric pinched his lips to stop their trembling. You've had help, but you've built a life for yourself after everything you've been through, and you've believed those things to be true since the day he left and you chose her. You stopped caring what everyone else thinks. It's why you work so hard. Now you need to remind yourself every day that you can do this, and if you and Addie are meant to have more kids, then it will happen when it happens. After a slight pause, Hiccup said in a softer tone, "Don't give up on her." Though it was probably hard to hear, something seemed to settle on Eric's shoulders like a cloak. Meeting Hiccup's eyes, he nodded, though his own were rimmed with red. "Thanks, Dad." Hiccup extended an arm and pulled him into an awkward side hug. Eric didn't seem to care and accepted it all the same. "Anytime, kiddo." The pitter-patter of uneven steps sounded before Darren's breathless voice said, "Is Daddy sad?" Eric quickly pulled away and wiped his face. "No, I'm okay." Darren Hiccup said, drawing his grandson's attention. "Daddy is sad. Why don't you give him a hug?" "Okay." Darren launched forward and Eric barely managed to open his arms in time. "Don't be sad, Daddy." Hiccup watched as Eric bit his lip, even as he squeezed the little boy tightly. Truly there was nothing better than getting a hug from your child, and no better medicine. And then Darren patted Eric's back and said, There, there." Eric choked on a laugh and pulled his son back. "Thanks, buddy. You all better now?" "Yeah, I'm better now." "Saints alive, I hope so." Heavy footfalls sounded as Finn dropped to the sand from the docks nearby. "I can't take all this mushiness." "Uncle Win." "Hey kiddo. You dishing out all the love today?" "Aha. I'm the bestest hugger." "Uncle Cliff taught you well, huh?" "MHM." Hiccup wasn't fooled by the bravado though. Finn's blue eyes scanned Eric head to toe as he approached, searching for more injuries. He seemed satisfied in seconds though and promptly dropped into the sand beside them. "Gods, it's hot." He stripped off his jacket just as Zap dove from the village high above. She roared as she plummeted and then disappeared into the lagoon with a mighty splash. Darren cackled with delight. "Again. I don't think Zappy can hear you from here, buddy," Hiccup said, watching curiously as Eric lifted one of his wrists, the uninjured one, and looked at it. "Finn, what's the word for truth in Latin?" Hiccup blinked. Finn pondered for a moment. "Veritas." "Why?" Eric lowered his wrist and squeezed Darren tight. "No reason." The sky was a grey haze as Hook Fang cut through the clouds, his lithe red body bright against the otherwise dull backdrop as he followed the purple terrible terror, Maybell. The ocean far below was black and unforgiving, full of chop and spray and depthless cold. Snotlout prided himself on being fearless, strong, and no nonsense. There was nothing in the god's green earth and sea that could shake him. Therefore, he gave the ocean a crooked grin and thumbed his nose. "Who you smilin' at? You see something we don't?" Tough Nut demanded and nearly lost his seat as he jerked Belch's head to the side. The dragon growled, sparks crackling in yellow streaks from between his teeth as he tried to ride himself. "Nay, but there is naught but ocean and sky." Snotlout shook his head. "How anyone could ride a dragon with Thor's lightning bolts that close to?" "You're awfully introspective today, oh ex-lover of mine," Rough Nut's voice said. "Terror got your tongue." Snotlout whipped around in his saddle in time to Rough Nut and Tough Nut's cackles. "Gods, can you believe that?" Tough Nut roared. "I always forget you two used to date." "Gross." "Well, Astrid took the only cute one, so I had to get creative somehow." "Listen, we all make bad decisions when we're dumb kids," Snotlout said, ignoring Rough Nut's cackles. "Who's the real crazy one, Rough Nut?" "You're the one who has like 18 kids. And with fish legs, no less." "Alas, he never shuts up," Rough Nut said in a strangely endearing tone. "All the more chillings to play with my Ava," Tough Nut said, puffing out his chest. "My tiny tot may not have brothers and sisters, but who needs those when the Thorsten clan be 30 men strong? We shall build an army." "We? Who's this we?" Rough Nut demanded. "Last I checked, I'm done having kids. I've already got an army." If you want an army, tough, you best get Busse. Snotlout sighed as the twins began to squabble about honorary sons and daughters. He and Heather had decided to take great care after their own twin boys entered the world. 3 was quite enough to be getting on with. Oh, he loved his Inga and his boys, Vidar and Dustin. Inga was a firecracker, Vidar was a miniature of himself, and Dustin was all his mother. Quiet in comparison to his siblings, but sharp as a whip, like Heather. But gods, if he wasn't grateful he didn't have more kids after the twins. It was only ironic that after all his teasing hiccup all those years ago that he'd have his own set of twins one day. And perhaps soon their family might be growing, if everything went well with Inga and Alton. It was strange how his Inga had changed. Suddenly she was no longer a petite girl with long dark hair in pigtail braids and a crooked grin with a plate of charred cookies in hand. Now she was a petite dark-haired beauty with salves and gauze in hand, willing to work herself to the bone to care for the sick and wounded. And she'd fallen for the boy who'd left Burke for a life of adventure. He'd always disliked that Alton, what with his own crooked grin and stupid, ruffled auburn hair and freckled skin from the sun and his firm handshake and responsible attitude and, man, terror does have his tongue. Tough Nut said. What's eating you? Snotlout growled. Nothing. He felt a flash of pain in his leg and jerked. Ow. What was that for? Rough Nut retracted the butt end of her spear. Spit it out. You've been grousing in silence for hours. Grouse is a kind of bird, you know. Tough Nut said. They're exceptionally succulent and tender once roasted on a spit with rosemary and potatoes. Tough Nut, focus. Snottipotty's having a moment. Snottipotty. Snotlout demanded. Tough Nut slumped in his saddle. I'm hungry. We embarked on this mission 2 days ago with nary a crumble of snackages to be had. You've literally got a sandwich in your bag from the bog burglars. Rough Nut said dryly. Or have you gone comatose since breakfast and forgotten half our journey already? I do. Tough Nut wrestled his satchel from the saddlebag behind him and yanked it open. Avast me mateys, but there be a sandwich in here. He raised it high over his head, crumbs and lettuce flying in all directions. The gods have blessed us. Yes, yes, eat your Sammy like a good boy. Rough Nut said and turned back to Snotlout. Seriously, what's your deal? Are you hangry too? Snotlout tried to ignore the sight of Tough Nut cramming half the sandwich into his mouth just over Rough Nut's shoulder. He tried to ignore her pierce-eyed stare, but eventually relented. I'm out here in the middle of nowhere tracking down a boy that I don't like, that's all. Oh, Rough Nut said, reaching over to clap Tough Nut on the back as he began to choke. Question is, do you not like him because he loves your girl? He doesn't love Inga. You sure about that? He's not good enough for Inga. No one is. Snotlout said, looking away. The words came out softer than he'd intended. Tough Nut brandished the other half of his sandwich. Honestly, I don't think I'm ready either. To give my daughter away. Snotlout rolled his eyes. Ava's 6. Doesn't matter. Still not ready. Tough Nut said, strangely somber. He picked out a tomato from beneath the meat and cheese and threw it into the abyss. Who puts tomatoes on sandwiches anyway? Rough Nut was watching him with an oddly perceptive look. Then she reached across the space between their dragons and patted his foot. He's a good kid. Don't be too hard on him when we find him. Snotlout scoffed. Oh, I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. For scaring Inga, for not replying to her last letter, for making me drag my butt all the way out here. A chirp sounded overhead and the 3 perked up. Maybelle made a sharp loop-de-loop in the air before plunging down, disappearing into the clouds. She's got the scent. Snotlout said. Follow her, Hook Fang. Rough Nut and Tough Nut shouted as Barf and Belch abruptly dove, keen on not losing the little dragon. Snotlout thought he heard Tough Nut cry out in dismay about his sandwich being lost to the sea, but didn't turn. They were close. Clouds and cold air buffeted them as they dove, and almost flew straight into the mast of a great ship. Hook Fang and Barf and Belch banked to the left, barely managing to avoid a collision. Snotlout's eyes went wide just as the twins went eerily silent. Maybelle perched onto his shoulder, her claws digging through his armor to the skin beneath. Thankfully it was dark enough and the night was moonless, so they could look their fill of the massive shipyard below. Beyond the harbor, a massive island, dark except for torchlight flickering up and down streets, lighting the way. "I don't know this island," Snotlout murmured. "I don't get it," Ruffnut whispered. "Maybelle was supposed to take us to Johann and Alton. So they have to be here or she wouldn't have stopped." Tuffnut sat up, strangely focused. "Look." Snotlout peered down and stiffened. There, not 7 ships down, was Johann's ship. "Come on. But let's go in quietly." It was unfortunate how large their dragons were. Stealth wasn't really their strong suit. The monstrous nightmare and hideous Ziplyback landed on the deck as quietly as possible. The ship rocked slightly with the new weight, water sloshing up the sides of the hull with a splash. The ship was dark and devoid of sound and life. Very unlike Johann's ship, where torches always burned and his whistling could always be heard from below decks. "The dragons can watch the deck. Let us know if anyone comes snooping around, Maybelle," Snotlout said, dismounting and drawing a sword. "You two, watch my 6." The twins followed him down the ladder and into the belly of the ship, where they proceeded to check room to room. They didn't dare call out for the risk of warning any enemies who might be lurking below decks. They soon realized that something was undeniably wrong and Maybelle really had come to them for help. Treasures lay scattered on floors, boxes upended, cots slashed and dismantled, belongings destroyed with very little care. What the perpetrators had been looking for, Snotlout didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe they'd been attacked by pirates and kidnapped. Maybe the ship had been pilfered by thieves after Johann and Alton's disappearance. Except that was a fate he wished he could settle on. These thoughts and other imaginings vanished from Snotlout's mind as he and the twins stopped in the door of the final room, the captain's quarters. It was empty, destroyed just as the other rooms had been, except for a single note, pinned to the door with a dagger. On its surface was a message scrawled in coarse black letters. "Your move." "What does it mean?" Ruffnut whispered. Snotlout thought of his baby girl's eyes, bright within a fire, back on Berk. Hopeful and waiting. Ignoring the sinking feeling of failure in his gut, Snotlout unpinned the note and stuffed it into his breast pocket. "It means Alton and Johann are gone." "Gone?" Tuffnut asked. "Gone as in kidnapped, or?" "I don't know and it doesn't matter," Snotlout said, turning and striding back up the way they'd come. "All I know is we need to get back to Berk as fast as we can." It was strange, Eric thought, how detached he felt from the world. He'd felt better after his talk with Hiccup and relaxing on the beach with his father-in-law, Finn and Darin. Now he was filled with less loathing for himself and his lot in life. Hiccup was right, and he did his best to nip in the bud any and all negative thoughts that followed him through the day. They continued to nag at him, but he didn't linger on them. He spent most of the day alone, something that Hiccup and Finn quailed at. But he promised, looking both of them in the eye, that he wouldn't do anything else drastic. Finn had been less interested in the promise, but Hiccup had finally relented after insisting that Charger go with him. He'd agreed. It had been their agreement all those years ago that Hiccup trusted him. It seemed his father-in-law was willing to give him that chance once again. Eric hated how far he'd let himself fall. Though his heart still hurt from Adriana's words, she hadn't been the one to pick up the dagger. She might have cut him deeply with her words, but it had been himself who'd made his wrist bleed. It was that age-old temptation, that he deserved the pain, that some sort of self-inflicted wound would make the internal thoughts go away. That had been the lie he'd grown accustomed to years ago, except it didn't satisfy that self-loathing. It didn't solve anything. It only caused more scarring, physical and emotional, and it hurt others. Not just himself. After leaving the Great Hall that morning, avoiding Adriana and her parents, all he'd wanted was to see Darin. For one purely selfish moment he'd almost not allowed himself to do so, wondering what Adriana would think if he'd picked Darin up himself. If she'd be angry if he did. And then he told himself that there was nothing wrong with wanting to be with his son. In fact, Darin was the only person he wanted to be with. Darin, who was his son, despite everything. Darin, who healed all wounds, though he'd never know that he wasn't just his mother's saving grace. He was his adopted father's, too. The word adopted clanged through him and he exhaled sharply, ignoring the emotions that rose up in his chest. Charger cocked his head at him, keeping vigil as instructed. He could probably smell the blood beneath the bandages. Eric ignored that thought and the pang of guilt it brought as he stepped over a branch in the well-worn dirt path. They'd been walking through the woods for hours. Step by uneven step. Thought by painful thought. Cliff always teased him for plunging too far into his thoughts. He was probably right. But the silence of the woods, the lack of bustling activity, the chirp of insects and birds and gentle scrape of scales against leather from Charger's saddle were cathartic. Out here in the silence, he could pick apart his muddled thoughts one by one, truth by truth. Darren is my son. Truth. He's adopted. Truth. So what? She thinks it's my fault. Is it my fault? Maybe. If it is, there's nothing I can do about it. If it's not, then she'll be proven wrong. No. True, but it's not about proving her wrong. Adriana. Adriana. Eric kicked a loose pebble out from under his prosthetic and sighed through his nose. Her name was like a spectre walking over his grave, sending a feeling of trepidation over his senses. How could she betray him like this? For not bringing this whole thing to his attention sooner. Not only had they lost the physical aspect of their relationship over the course of weeks, but also their communication. She'd lost her ability to empathize. They could have talked it through, borne it together, just like they did with everything. But it wasn't his fault. Eric came to a halt, drawing Charger's attention. It's not my fault. Truth. The admission felt both wrong and right at the same time. He didn't want to admit it and yet a weight seemed to lift off his shoulders. It's not my fault. That she stopped hoping. That she gave up. That she blames me. That her fear caused her to lash out to the closest, easiest target. At the end of the day, he hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't wished for this sort of pain and burden. And yet, this was the truth of the matter. It was completely understandable that she'd get frustrated. That she'd get upset and be tempted to give up. She had no right or excuse to say the horrible things she did. She didn't have any reason to be so cruel about it. But, he understood. It only took once with. Eric closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. False. That's not how she meant that. Because in his heart of hearts, he knew she would never compare him to Brandine. Just the fact that she was frustrated because she'd yet to conceive their own child was proof. She wouldn't go back to Brandine for anything. Would never even consider it. That wasn't the point she'd been trying to make. Granted, a poorly conceived point, but a point nonetheless. She wasn't saying she didn't want kids with him or that he wasn't good enough for her. She was frustrated because she wanted that fulfilled more than anything, and it wasn't working. No, it just hasn't happened yet. An important distinction to make if there ever was one. Because he refused to believe that he couldn't have kids. Maybe after 10 years of marriage or more they'd have a better understanding, but it hadn't been that long. Not even close. And because she was afraid and didn't know what to do with that possibility, she'd taken it to the next level. We have a son. We should be grateful and just move on. Making it personal, too personal. Driving in the wedge with a well-placed blow that she hadn't realized she'd even planted. Just as she'd done on many occasions throughout her life. To his surprise, he found himself smiling. How could his smart, beautiful, brilliant Annie not see just how painful her words could be? The problem was merely that she thought too quickly for her own good and didn't think through the consequences of what those words might do to a person. For those moments, she led with her heart and not her head, and would do whatever it took to get that point across. Only to realize afterward the sort of damage she'd caused. Laughing softly, Eric reached up to rub his face. Quite the heartbreaker, his Annie. He couldn't stop loving her despite that. Maybe thinking too quickly and saying things without considering the repercussions was something she struggled with, but he couldn't hate her for that. Gods knew he had his own flaws to deal with too. Gods knew she might be disgusted with him for hurting himself again. No. Annie would never hate him for that. If anything, she'd feel even worse for making him feel so horrible that all this happened. All of it. Yes, the words hurt. Maybe some of them were true. Maybe it was his fault they weren't having more kids. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he'd never find out. But he still loved her. He couldn't hate her if he tried or even stay angry with her. Even though it all still hurt, he wanted to fix things. Besides all that, things had to change. He lifted his shirt sleeve to reveal the bandage around his forearm and pondered the bandage, the white scars above and below it. He was done marring his skin on purpose. He'd regretted